29. Egocentric Bias. Unfortunately, no one can be told who J.K. Rowling is. You have to see her for yourself. Science disclaimers. Luasha points out that the theory of empathy in ch. 27, you use your own brain to simulate others, isn't quite a known scientific fact. The evidence so far points in that direction, but we haven't analyzed the brain circuitry and proven it. Similarly, timeless formulations of quantum mechanics, alluded to in ch. 28, are so elegant that I'd be shocked to find the final theory had time in it, but they're not established yet either. There'd been a sinking feeling in Hermione's stomach lately, every time she heard the other students talking about her and Harry. She'd been in a shower stall this morning when she'd overheard a conversation between Morag and Padma that had been the last straw piled on top of quite a lot of other straws. She was starting to think that getting involved in a rivalry with Harry Potter had been a terrible mistake. If she'd just stayed away from Harry Potter, she could have been Hermione Granger, the brightest academic star of Hogwarts, who was earning more points for Ravenclaw than anyone. She wouldn't have been as famous as the boy who lived, but she would have been famous for herself. Instead, the boy who lived had an academic rival, and her name happened to be Hermione Granger. And worse, she had gone on a date with him. The idea of getting into a romance with Harry had seemed like an appealing idea at first. She'd read books like that, and if there was anyone in Hogwarts who was a candidate for the heroine's love interest, it was obviously Harry Potter. Bright, funny, famous, sometimes scary. So she'd forced Harry into going on a date with her. And now she was his love interest. Or worse, one of the options on his dinner menu. She'd been in a shower stall that morning and just about to turn on the water, when she'd heard giggles coming from outside. And she'd heard Morag talking about how that Muggle-born girl probably wouldn't fight hard enough to win against Ginevra Weasley, and Padma speculating that Harry Potter might decide he wanted both. It was like they didn't understand that girls had options on their dinner menu and boys fought over them. But that wasn't even the part that hurt, really. It was that when she scored 98 on one of Professor McGonagall's tests, the news wasn't that Hermione Granger had scored the highest in the class, the news was that Harry Potter's rival had scored 7 more points than him. If you got too close to the boy who lived, you became part of his story. You didn't get your own. And the thought had come to Hermione that she should just walk away, but that would have been too sad. But she did want to get back what she'd accidentally given away by letting herself become known as Harry's rival. She wanted to be a separate person again instead of Harry Potter's third leg. Was that too much to ask? It was a hard trap to climb out of once you fell in. No matter how high you scored in class, even if you did something that deserved a special dinnertime announcement, it just meant you were rivaling Harry Potter again. But she thought she'd come up with a way. Something to do that wouldn't be seen as pushing up on the opposite end of Harry Potter's seesaw. It would be hard. It would go against her nature. She would have to fight someone very evil. And she would need to ask someone even more evil for help. Hermione raised her hand to knock upon that terrible door. She hesitated. Hermione realized she was being silly, and raised her hand a bit higher. She tried to knock again. Her hand quite failed to touch the door. And then the door swung open anyway. "Dear me," said the spider, sitting in its web. "Was it really that hard to lose a single Quirrell point, Miss Granger?" Hermione stood there with her hand raised, her cheeks growing pink. It had been. "Well, Miss Granger, I shall be merciful," said the evil Professor Quirrell. "Consider it already lost. There, I have taken a hard choice from you. Are you not grateful?" "Professor Quirrell," Hermione managed to say in a voice that squeaked a little. "I have a lot of Quirrell points, don't I?" "You do indeed," said Professor Quirrell. "Though one less than you had before. Terrible, isn't it? Just think, if I don't like your reason for coming here, you could lose another 50. Maybe I'd take them away one by one. By one." Hermione's cheeks were going even redder. "You're really evil, did anyone ever tell you that?" "Miss Granger," Professor Quirrell said gravely, "it can be dangerous to give people compliments like that when they have not been truly earned. The recipient might feel bashful and undeserving and want to do something worthy of your praise. Now what was it you wanted to talk to me about, Miss Granger?" It was after lunch on Thursday afternoon, and Hermione and Harry were ensconced in a little library nook, with a quietus field up so they could talk. Harry was lying stomach down on the ground with his elbows resting on the floor and his head in his hands and his feet kicking up casually behind him. Hermione was occupying a stuffed chair much too large for her, like she was the Hermione center of a candy shell. Harry had suggested that they could, as a first pass, read just the titles of all the books in the library, and then Hermione could read all the tables of contents. Hermione had thought this was a brilliant idea. She'd never done that with a library before. Unfortunately, there was a slight flaw in this plan. Namely, they were both Ravenclaws. Hermione was reading a book called Magical Mnemonics. Harry was reading a book called The Skeptical Wizard. Each had thought it was just one special exception they would make only this one time, and neither had yet realized it was impossible for either of them to ever finish reading all the book titles no matter how hard they tried. The quiet of their little nook was broken by two words. "Oh, no," Harry suddenly said out loud, sounding like the words had been torn out of him. There was a bit more quiet. "He didn't," Harry said, in the same voice. Then she heard Harry start giggling helplessly. Hermione looked up from her book. "All right," she said, "what is it?" "I just found out why you never ask the Weasleys about the family rat," Harry said. "It's really awful and I shouldn't be laughing and I'm a terrible person." "Yes," Hermione said primly, "you are. Tell me too." "Okay, first the background. There's a whole chapter in this book about Sirius Black conspiracy theories. You remember who that is, right?" "Of course," said Hermione. "Sirius Black was a traitor, a friend of James Potter who had let Voldemort into the protected home of the Potters. So it turns out there were a number of, shall we say, irregularities, associated with Black going to Azkaban. He didn't get a trial, and the junior minister in charge when the Aurors arrested Black was none other than Cornelius Fudge, who became our current Minister of Magic." That sounded a little suspicious to Hermione too, and she said as much. Harry made a shrugging motion with his shoulders, as he lay on the floor looking at his book. Suspicious things happen all the time, and if you're a conspiracy theorist you can always find something. "But no trial," said Hermione. "It was right after the Dark Lord's defeat," Harry said, his voice serious as he said it. "Things were incredibly chaotic, and when the Aurors tracked down Black he was standing there laughing in a street ankle-deep in blood, with 20 eyewitnesses to recount how he'd killed a friend of my father's named Peter Pettigrew plus 12 bystanders. I'm not saying I approve of Black not getting a trial. But these are wizards we're talking about here, so it's not really any more suspicious than, I don't know, the sort of thing people point to when they want to argue over who shot John F. Kennedy. So anyway, Sirius Black is the wizarding Lee Harvey Oswald. There's all sorts of conspiracy theories about who really betrayed my parents instead of him, and one of the favorites is Peter Pettigrew, and this is where it starts getting complicated." Hermione listened, fascinated. "But how do you go from there to the Weasley's pet rat?" "Hold on," said Harry, "I'm getting there. Now, after Pettigrew's death it came out that he'd been a spy for the Light, not a double agent, just someone who snuck around and found things out. He'd been good at that since he was a teenager, even in Hogwarts he had a reputation for finding out all sorts of secrets. So the conspiracy theory is that Pettigrew became an unregistered animagus while he was still in Hogwarts, an animagus of something small that could scurry around and listen to conversations. The main problem being that successful animagi are rare and doing it as a teenager would be really unlikely, so of course the conspiracy theory says that my father and Black were unregistered animagi too. And in that conspiracy theory, Pettigrew himself killed the 12 bystanders, turned into his small animagus form, and ran. So Michael Shermer says there are 4 additional problems with this. 1. Black was the only one besides my parents who knew how to get through the wards around their house. Harry's voice was a little hard as he said that. 2. Black was a more likely suspect to start with than Pettigrew. There's a rumor Black deliberately tried to get a student killed during his time at Hogwarts, and he was from this really nasty pureblood family. Bellatrix Black was literally his cousin. 3. Black was 20 times the fighting wizard that Pettigrew was, even if he wasn't as smart. The duel between them would have been like Professor Quirrell versus Professor Sprout. Pettigrew probably didn't even get a chance to draw his wand, let alone fake all the evidence the conspiracy theory requires. And 4. Black was standing in the street laughing. But the rat, said Hermione. Right, Harry said. Well, to make a long story short, Bill Weasley decided that his little brother Percy's pet rat was Pettigrew's animagus form. Hermione's jaw dropped. Yes, Harry said, you wouldn't exactly expect evil Pettigrew to be living a sad and furtive life as the pet rat of an enemy wizarding family. He'd either be with the Malfoys or, more likely, off in the Caribbean after a bit of plastic surgery. Anyway, Bill knocks out his little brother Percy, stuns and grabs the rat, sends out all these emergency messages. Oh, no, Hermione said, the words torn out of her. And somehow manages to gather Dumbledore, the Minister of Magic, and the head Auror. He didn't, said Hermione. And of course when they get there they think he's crazy, but they use Veritas Oculum on the rat anyway, just to be sure, and what do they discover? She would have died. A rat. You win a cookie. So they drag poor Bill Weasley off to St. Mungo's and it turned out to be a pretty standard schizophrenic break. It just happens to some people, especially young men around what we'd consider college age. Guy was convinced he was 97 years old and had died and gone back in time to his younger self via train station. And he responded perfectly well to antipsychotics and is back to normal and everything's fine now, except people don't talk as much anymore about serious Black conspiracy theories, and you don't ever ask the Weasleys about the family rat. Hermione was giggling helplessly. It was really awful and she shouldn't be laughing and she was a terrible person. The thing I don't understand, Harry said, after their giggles had died down, is why Black would hunt down Pettigrew instead of running as fast as he could. He had to know the Aurors would be after him. I wonder if they got the reason out of Black before they took him to Azkaban. See, this is why people who are absolutely positively guilty still go through the legal system and get trials. Hermione had to agree with that. Soon Harry was done with his book while Hermione was only halfway through hers. Hers was a much more difficult book than Harry's, but she still felt embarrassed about that. And then she had to put magical mnemonics back in the shelf and drag herself away, because it was time for her to face the most dreaded class in Hogwarts, broomstick riding. Harry tagged along as she walked there, even though his own class wasn't until an hour and a half later, like a fighter jet escorting a sad little propeller plane on its way to its own funeral. The boy wished her goodbye in a quiet, sympathetic voice, and she walked onto the grassy fields of doom. And there was much shrieking and almost falling and horrible brushes with death and the ground in completely the wrong place and the sun getting in her eyes and Morag buzzing her and Mandy thinking she was being subtle about always being near enough to catch her if she fell, and she knew the other students were laughing at both of them, but she never said anything to Mandy because she didn't actually want to die. After 10 million years the class ended, and she was back in the ground where she belonged until next Thursday. Sometimes she had nightmares about it always being Thursday. Why everyone had to learn this, when they were just going to apparate or flow or portkey everywhere once they grew up, was a complete and utter mystery to Hermione. Nobody actually needed to ride broomsticks as an adult, it was like being forced to play dodgeball in PE. At least Harry had the decency to be ashamed of being good at it. It was a couple of hours later, and she was in a Hufflepuff study hall with Hannah, Susan, Leanne, and Megan. Professor Flitwick, surprisingly diffident for a teacher, had asked if she might possibly maybe help those four with their charms homework for a while, even though they weren't Ravenclaws, and Hermione had felt so proud she'd almost burst. Hermione took a piece of parchment, spilled a little bit of ink on it, tore it into 4 pieces, crumpled them, and tossed the pieces on the table. She could have gotten it just from crumpling it, but doing all that made it more like garbage, and that helped when someone was first practicing the disposal charm. Hermione sharpened her ears and eyes, and said, "Okay, try it. Everdo. 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 Everdo." Hermione didn't think she'd quite caught all the problems. "Can you all try it again?" An hour later Hermione had concluded that, 1. Leanne and Megan were sort of sloppy, but if you asked them to keep practicing something, they would. 2. Hannah and Susan were focused and driven to the point where you had to keep telling them to slow down and relax and think about things instead of trying so hard. It was odd to think that those 2 would soon be hers. And 3. She liked helping Hufflepuffs. The whole study hall had a very cheerful atmosphere. When she left for dinner, she found the boy who lived reading a book while he waited to escort her. It made her feel flattered, and also a little worried because Harry didn't seem to really talk to anyone besides her. "Did you know there's a girl in Hufflepuff who's a metamorphagus?" said Hermione as they headed toward the Great Hall. "She makes her hair really red, like stop sign red, not Weasley red, and when she spilled hot tea on herself she turned into a black-haired boy until she got it under control again." "Really? Cool," said Harry, sounding a bit distracted. Hermione, just to check, you know tomorrow is the last day to sign up for Professor Quirrell's armies, right?" "Yes," Hermione said, "the armies of the evil Professor Quirrell." Her voice was a little angry, though Harry didn't know why, of course. "Hermione," Harry said, his voice exasperated, "he's not evil. He's a little bit dark and a whole lot Slytherin. It's not the same as being evil." Harry Potter had too many words for things, that was his problem. He would have been better off if he'd just divided the universe into good and bad. "Professor Quirrell called me up in front of the whole class and told me to shoot someone." "He was right," Harry said, his face sober. "I'm sorry, Hermione, but he was. You should have shot me, I wouldn't have minded. You can't learn battle magic if you can't practice against real opponents using real spells. And now you're doing okay in sparring, aren't you?" Hermione was only 12, and so she knew, but she couldn't put it into words, she couldn't find the thing to say that would convince Harry. Professor Quirrell had taken a young girl and called up that girl in front of everyone, and ordered her to open fire without provocation on a classmate. It didn't matter if Professor Quirrell was right about her needing to learn it. Professor McGonagall wouldn't ever have done that. Professor Flitwick wouldn't ever have done that. Maybe not even Professor Snape would have done that. Professor Quirrell was evil. But she couldn't find the words, and she knew that Harry would never believe her. "Hermione, I've talked to older students," Harry said. "Professor Quirrell could be the only competent defense professor we get in all 7 years at Hogwarts. Anything else we can learn later. If we want to study defense, we have to do it this year. The students who sign up for the extracurricular stuff are going to be learning huge amounts, way beyond what the ministry thinks first years are supposed to study. Did you know we're going to be learning the Patronus Charm in January?" "The Patronus Charm," Hermione said, her voice going up in surprise. Her book said that was one of the brightest magics known, a weapon against the darkest creatures, cast with pure positive emotions. It wasn't something she'd expect the evil Professor Quirrell to teach, or arrange to be taught, since Hermione couldn't imagine he could do the spell himself. Yes, Harry said, students don't usually learn the Patronus Charm until their 5th years or even later. But Professor Quirrell says the ministry schedules were made up by talking flobberworms, and the ability to cast the Patronus Charm depends on emotions more than magical strength. Professor Quirrell says that he thinks most students do way less than they can, and this year he's going to prove it. There was the usual tone of odd worship that Harry's voice had when he talked about Professor Quirrell, and Hermione gritted her teeth and kept walking. I already signed up, actually, Hermione said, her voice a little quiet. I did it this morning. For everything, just like you said. In for a penny, in for a pound was the usual expression. Besides, she didn't want to lose, and if she wanted to win, she had to learn. So you will be in the armies, then? Harry's voice was suddenly enthusiastic. That's awesome, Hermione. I've already gotten my list of soldiers, but I'm sure Professor Quirrell will let me add one more, or trade. I'm not joining your army. Hermione's voice was sharp. She knew it was a reasonable assumption, but it still annoyed her. Harry blinked. Not Draco Malfoy's, surely. So you want to be in the Third Army? Even though we don't know who the general is yet. Harry sounded surprised and a little wounded, and she couldn't blame him, though of course she did blame him, since in fact it was all his fault. But why not mine? Think about it, Hermione snapped, and maybe you'll work it out. And she sped up her stride and left Harry gaping behind her. Professor Quirrell, Draco said in his most formal voice, I must protest your appointment of Hermione Granger as the third general. Oh, said Professor Quirrell, leaning back in his chair in a casual and relaxed manner. Protest away, Mr. Malfoy. Granger is unfit for the position, said Draco. Professor Quirrell tapped a finger on his cheek thoughtfully. Why yes, she is. Do you have any further protests? Professor Quirrell, said Harry Potter beside him, with all due respect to Miss Granger's many outstanding academic talents and the Quirrell points she has justly earned in your classes, her personality is not suited to military command. Draco had been relieved when Harry had agreed to accompany him to Professor Quirrell's office. It wasn't just that Harry was a gigantic blatant teacher's pet where Professor Quirrell was concerned. Draco had also started to worry that Harry actually was friends with Granger. It had been a while now and he still hadn't made his move. But this was more like it. I agree with Mr. Potter, said Draco. Appointing her as a general turns it into a farce. Harshly put, said Harry, but I cannot bring myself to disagree with Mr. Malfoy. To be blunt, Professor Quirrell, Hermione Granger has around as much intent to kill as a bowl of wet grapes. That, said Professor Quirrell mildly, is not a thing I would fail to notice myself. You are telling me nothing I do not already know. It was Draco's turn to say something, but the conversation had suddenly hiccuped. That answer had not been in the possibilities he and Harry had brainstormed before coming here. What did you say after the teacher said that he knew everything you knew and he was still going to commit an obvious mistake? The silence stretched. Is this some sort of plot? Harry said slowly. Must everything I do be some sort of plot? Said Professor Quirrell. Can't I ever create chaos just for the sake of chaos? Draco almost choked. Not in your battle magic class, Harry said with calm certainty. Other places, maybe, but not there. Professor Quirrell slowly raised his eyebrows. Harry gazed steadily back at him. Draco shivered. Well then, Professor Quirrell said. Neither of you seem to have considered a very simple question. Who could I appoint instead of Miss Granger? Blaise Zabini, Draco said without hesitation. Any other suggestions? Said Professor Quirrell, sounding quite amused. Anthony Goldstein and Ernie Macmillan, came the thought before Draco's common sense kicked in and ruled out Mudbloods and Hufflepuffs no matter how aggressively they dueled. So instead Draco just said, what's wrong with Zabini? I see, Harry said slowly. I don't, said Draco. Why not Zabini? Professor Quirrell looked at Draco. Because, Mr. Malfoy, no matter how hard he tries, he'll never be able to keep up with you or Mr. Potter. The shock of it staggered Draco. You can't believe Granger is going to. He's gambling on her, Harry said quietly. It's not guaranteed. The odds aren't even good. She'll probably never give us a good fight, and even if she does, it may take her months to learn. But she's the only one in our year with any chance at all of growing to beat us. Draco's hands twitched but didn't clench into fists. Showing up as your supporter and then backing out was a classic undermining tactic, so Harry Potter was in it with Granger and that implied. But Professor, Harry went on smoothly, I'm worried Hermione will be miserable as the general of an army. I'm speaking as her friend now, Professor Quirrell. The competition might be good for Draco and me, but what you're asking her to do isn't good for her. Never mind. Your friendship for Hermione Granger does you credit, Professor Quirrell said dryly. Especially as you are able to be friends with Draco Malfoy at the same time. Quite a feat, that. Harry suddenly looked a little nervous, meaning he probably felt a lot more nervous, and Draco silently swore to himself. Of course Harry wasn't going to fool Professor Quirrell. And I doubt Miss Granger would appreciate your friendly concern, said Professor Quirrell. She asked me for the position, Mr. Potter, I did not ask her. Harry was quiet at this for a moment. Then he flashed Draco a quick look that mixed apology and warning, saying at the same time, sorry, I did my best and we'd better not press it any further. As for her being miserable, Professor Quirrell went on, a slight smile now playing about his lips, I suspect that she will have a much easier time with the rigors of her position than either of you suspect, and that she will put up a good fight much sooner than you think. Harry and Draco both gasped in horror. You're not going to advise her, are you? Said Draco, utterly aghast. I never signed up to fight you, said Harry. The smile playing around Professor Quirrell's lips grew wider. As a matter of fact, I did offer to share a few suggestions regarding Miss Granger's first battles. Professor Quirrell, said Harry. Oh, don't worry, Professor Quirrell said. She turned me down, just as I expected. Draco's eyes narrowed. Dear me, Mr. Potter, said Professor Quirrell, didn't anyone ever tell you it's rude to stare? You're not going to secretly help her some other way, are you? Said Harry. Would I do that? Said Professor Quirrell. Yes, said Draco and Harry at the same time. I am wounded by your lack of trust. Well then, I promise not to help General Granger in any way that the two of you don't know about. And now I suggest that both of you be about your military affairs. November approaches, and swiftly. Draco saw the implications before the door had closed all the way behind them on their way out of Professor Quirrell's office. Harry had once spoken dismissively of people stuff. And now that was Draco's only hope. Let him not realize, let him not realize. We should just attack the Granger girl first and get her out of our way, said Draco. After we crush her, we can have our own contest without any distractions. Now that doesn't really seem fair to her, does it? Said Harry in a mild voice. What do you care? Said Draco. She's your rival, right? Then, with just the right note of suspicion in his voice, don't tell me you've started really liking her, after being her rival all this time. Founders forbid, said Harry. What can I say, Draco? I merely have a natural sense of justice. Granger does too, you know. She has a very firm grasp on good and evil, and she's probably going to attack evil first. Having a name like Malfoy is just asking for it, you know. Damn it. Harry, said Draco, sounding wounded and maybe a little superior, don't you want to fight fairly against me? You mean rather than attacking you after you've already lost some of your forces beating Granger? Said Harry. Oh, I don't know. Maybe after I get bored with just winning I'll try that fair thing. Maybe she'll attack you, Draco said. You're her rival. But I'm her friendly rival, Harry said with an evil grin. I bought her a nice birthday present and everything. You wouldn't go around sabotaging your friendly rival like that. What about sabotaging your friend's chance at a fair fight? Said Draco angrily. I thought we were friends. Let me rephrase that, said Harry. Granger wouldn't sabotage a friendly rival. But that's because she has the killing intention of a bowl of wet grapes. You would. You totally would. And guess what, so would I. Damn it. If it had been a play, there would have been dramatic music. The hero, impeccably turned out in green-trimmed robes and perfectly combed white blonde hair, faced the villain. The villain, leaning back in a simple wooden chair with her buckteeth clearly visible and stray chestnut curls drifting over her cheeks, faced the hero. It was Wednesday, October 30th, and the first battle was coming up on Sunday. Draco was standing in General Granger's office, a room the size of a small classroom. Why each general's office was so large, Draco wasn't quite sure. A chair and a desk would have worked for him. He wasn't even clear on why the generals needed offices at all, his soldiers knew where to find him. Unless Professor Quirrell had deliberately arranged the huge offices for them as a sign of status, in which case Draco was all for it. Granger sat on the room's single chair like a throne, all the way on the other end of the office from where the door opened. There was a long oblong table stretched across the middle of the room between them, and 4 small circular tables scattered around the corners, but only that one single chair, all the way at the opposite end. The room had windows along one wall, and one beam of sunlight touched the top of Granger's hair like a glowing crown. It would have been nice if Draco could have walked slowly forward. But there was a table in the way, and Draco had to go around it diagonally, and there was no good way to do that in a dramatic and dignified fashion. Had that been deliberate? If it had been his father, it surely would have been, but this was Granger, so surely not. There was nowhere for him to sit, and Granger hadn't stood up, either. Draco kept the outrage entirely off his face. Well, Mr. Draco Malfoy, Granger said once he stood before her, you requested an audience with me and I have been so gracious as to grant it. What was your plea? Come with me to visit Malfoy Manor, my father and I would like to show you some interesting spells. Your rival, Potter, came to me with an offer, said Draco, putting a serious look on his face. He doesn't mind losing to me, but would be humiliated if you won. So he wants to join with me and wipe you out immediately, not just in our first battle, all of them. If I won't do that, Potter wants me to hold back or harass you, while he launches an all-out attack on you as his first move. I see, Granger said, looking surprised. And you're offering to help me against him? Of course, said Draco smoothly. I didn't think what he wanted to do to you was fair. Why, that's very nice of you, Mr. Malfoy, said Granger. I'm sorry for how I spoke to you earlier. We should be friends. Can I call you Drakey? Alarm bells started to sound in Draco's head, but there was a chance she meant it. Of course, said Draco, if I can call you Hermie. Draco was pretty sure he saw her expression flicker. Anyway, Draco said, I was thinking it would serve Potter right if we both attacked him and wiped him out. But that wouldn't be fair to Mr. Potter, would it? Said Granger. I think it'd be very fair, Draco said. He was planning to do it to you first. Granger was giving him a stern look that could possibly have intimidated him if he'd been a Hufflepuff instead of a Malfoy. You think I'm pretty stupid, don't you, Mr. Malfoy? Draco smiled charmingly. No, Miss Granger, but I thought I'd at least check. So, what do you want? Are you offering to bribe me? Said Granger. Sure, said Draco. Can I just slip you a galleon and have you beat on Potter instead of me for the rest of the year? Nope, said Granger, but you can offer me 10 galleons and have me attack both of you equally, instead of just you. 10 galleons is a lot of money, Draco said cautiously. I didn't know the Malfoys were poor, said Granger. Draco stared at Granger. He was starting to get a strange feeling about this. That particular reply didn't seem like it should have come from this particular girl. Well, said Draco, you don't get to be rich by wasting money, you know. I don't know if you know what a dentist is, Mr. Malfoy, but my parents are dentists and anything less than 10 galleons isn't worth my time at all. 3 galleons, Draco said, more as a probe than anything else. Nope, said Granger. If you want an equal fight at all, I don't believe that a Malfoy wants an equal fight less than he wants 10 galleons. Draco was starting to get a very strange feeling about this. No, said Draco. No, said Granger. This is a limited time offer, Mr. Malfoy. Are you sure you want to risk a whole year of being miserably crushed by the boy who lived? That would be pretty embarrassing for the House of Malfoy, wouldn't it? It was a very persuasive argument, one that was hard to refuse, but you didn't get to be rich by spending money when your heart told you it was a setup. No, said Draco. See you on Sunday, said Granger. Draco turned and walked out of the office without another word. That had been not right. Hermione, Harry said patiently, we're supposed to be plotting against each other. You could even betray me and it wouldn't mean anything outside the battlefield. Hermione shook her head. It wouldn't be nice, Harry. Harry sighed. I don't think you're getting into the spirit of this at all. It wouldn't be nice. She'd actually said that. Hermione didn't know whether to be insulted at what Harry thought of her, or worried about whether she really did sound like that much of a goody two-shoes usually. It was probably time to change the subject. Anyway, are you doing anything special for tomorrow? Said Hermione. It's. Her voice cut off abruptly as she realized. Yes, Hermione, Harry said a little tightly, what day is it? Interlude. There was a time when October 31st had been called Halloween in magical Britain. Now it was Harry Potter Day. Harry had turned down all the offers, even the one from Minister Fudge which might have been good for future political favors and which he really should have gritted his teeth and taken. But to Harry, October 31st would always be the Dark Lord killed my parents' day. There should have been a quiet, dignified memorial service somewhere, and if there was one, he hadn't been invited. Hogwarts got the day off to celebrate. Even the Slytherins didn't dare wear black outside their own dorm. There were special events and special foods and the teachers looked the other way if anyone ran through the hallways. It was the 10th anniversary, after all. Harry spent the day in his trunk so as not to spoil it for anyone else, eating snack bars in place of meals, reading some of his sadder science fiction books, no fantasy, and writing a letter to Mum and Dad that was much longer than the ones he usually sent. 30. Working in groups, PT1. J.K. Rolling if a man tries to bother you, you can think blue, count 2, and look for a red shoe. The day was Sunday, November 3rd, and soon the three great powers of their school year, Harry Potter, Draco Malfoy, and Hermione Granger, would begin their struggle for supreme dominance. Harry was slightly annoyed by the way the boy who lived had been demoted from supreme dominance to one of 3 equal rivals just by entering the contest, but he expected to get it back soon. The battleground was a section of non-forbidden forest, dense with trees, because Professor Quirrell thought that being able to see all the enemy forces was too boring even for your very first battle. All the students who were not actually in a first-year army were camped out nearby and watching on screens that Professor Quirrell had set up. Except for 3 Gryffindors in their 4th year, who were currently sick and confined to healers' beds by Madame Pomfrey. Aside from that, everyone was there. The students were dressed, not in their ordinary school robes, but in Muggle camouflage uniforms that Professor Quirrell had obtained somewhere and supplied in sufficient quantity and variety to fit everyone. It wasn't that students would have worried about stains and rips, that was what charms were for. But as Professor Quirrell had explained to the surprised wizardborns, nice dignified clothing was not efficient for hiding in forests or dodging around trees. And on each uniform's breast, a patch bearing the name and insignia of your army. A small patch. If you wanted your soldiers to wear, say, colored ribbons so that they could identify each other at a distance, and risk the enemy getting their hands on the ribbons, that was all up to you. Harry had tried to get the name Diagon Army. Draco had pitched a fit and said that would confuse everyone completely. Professor Quirrell had ruled that Draco could lay prior claim to the name, if he wished. So now Harry was fighting Diagon Army. This probably wasn't a good sign. For their insignia, instead of the two obvious dragon's head breathing fire, Draco had elected to simply go with the fire. Elegant, understated, deadly, this is what's left after we've passed. Very Malfoy. Harry, after considering alternate choices such as the 501st Provisional Battalion and Harry's minions O'Doom, had decided that his army would be known by the simple and dignified appellation of the Chaos Legion. Their insignia was a hand poised with fingers ready to snap. It was universally agreed that this wasn't a good sign. Harry had earnestly advised Hermione that the young boys serving under her were probably nervous about her being a girl with a reputation for being nice, and that she should pick something scary that would reassure them of her toughness and make them proud to be part of her army, like the Blood Commandos or something. Hermione had named her army the Sunshine Regiment. Their insignia was a smiley face. And in 10 minutes, they would be at war. Harry stood in the bright forest clearing that was their assigned starting location, an area of open space with old and rotting tree stumps that had been cleared away for some unknown purpose, ground coated with a small scattering of blown leaves and the dried gray remnants of grass that had failed the test of summer's heat, and the sun shining down brilliantly from above. Around him were the 23 soldiers that Professor Quirrell had assigned to him. Nearly all of Gryffindor had signed up, of course, and more than half of Slytherin, and less than half of Hufflepuff, and a handful of Ravenclaw. In Harry's army there were 12 Gryffindors and 6 Slytherins and 4 Hufflepuffs and 1 Ravenclaw besides himself. Not that there was any way to tell that by looking at the uniforms. No red, no green, no yellow, no blue. Just Muggle camouflage patterns, and a patch on the breast with the device of a hand poised to snap its fingers. Harry looked upon his 23 soldiers, all wearing the same uniforms with no marks of group identity save that single patch. And lo, Harry smiled, because he understood what this part of Professor Quirrell's master plan was about, and Harry was taking full advantage of it for his own purposes, too. There was a legendary episode in social psychology called the Robber's Cave Experiment. It had been set up in the bewildered aftermath of World War II, with the intent of investigating the causes and remedies of conflicts between groups. The scientists had set up a summer camp for 22 boys from 22 different schools, selecting them to all be from stable middle-class families. The first phase of the experiment had been intended to investigate what it took to start a conflict between groups. The 22 boys had been divided into 2 groups of 11. And this had been quite sufficient. The hostility had started from the moment the 2 groups had become aware of each other's existences in the state park, insults being hurled on the first meeting. They'd named themselves the Eagles and the Rattlers, they hadn't needed names for themselves when they thought they were the only ones in the park, and had proceeded to develop contrasting group stereotypes, the Rattlers thinking of themselves as rough and tough and swearing heavily, the Eagles correspondingly deciding to think of themselves as upright and proper. The other part of the experiment had been testing how to resolve group conflicts. Bringing the boys together to watch fireworks hadn't worked at all. They'd just shouted at each other and stayed apart. What had worked was warning them that there might be vandals in the park, and the 2 groups needing to work together to solve a failure of the park's water system. A common task, a common enemy. Harry had a strong suspicion Professor Quirrell had understood this principle very well indeed when he had chosen to create 3 armies per year. 3 armies. Not 4. And definitely not segregated by house. Except that no Slytherins had been assigned to Draco besides Mr. Crabbe and Mr. Goyle. It was things like this which reassured Harry that Professor Quirrell, despite his affected dark atmosphere and his pretense of neutrality in the conflict between good and evil, was secretly backing good, not that Harry would ever dare say that out loud. And Harry had decided to take full advantage of Professor Quirrell's plan to define a group identity his way. The Rattlers, once they'd met the Eagles, had started thinking of themselves as rough and tough, and they'd conducted themselves accordingly. The Eagles had thought of themselves as good and proper. And in that bright forest clearing, scattered around the old and rotting tree stumps, outlined in the sun shining down brilliantly from above, General Potter and his 23 soldiers were arranged in nothing remotely resembling a formation. Some soldiers stood, some soldiers sat, some stood on one leg just to be different. It was the Chaos Legion, after all. And if there wasn't a reason to stand in neat little lines, Harry had said disdainfully, there weren't going to be neat little lines. Harry had divided the army into 6 squads of 4 soldiers each squad commanded by a squad suggester. All troops were under strict orders to disobey any orders they were given if it seemed like a good idea at the time, including that one. Unless Harry or the squad suggester prefixed the order with Merlin says, in which case you were supposed to actually obey. The Chaos Legion's chief attack was to split up and run in from multiple directions, randomly changing vectors and firing the approved sleep spell as rapidly as you could rebuild the magical strength. And if you saw a chance to distract or confuse the enemy, you took it. Fast, creative, unpredictable, non-homogeneous. Don't just obey orders, think about whether what you're doing right now makes sense. Harry wasn't quite as sure as he'd pretended that this was the optimum of military efficiency. But he'd been given a golden opportunity to change how some students thought about themselves, and that was how he intended to use it. 5 minutes to wartime, according to Harry's watch. General Potter walked, not marched, over to where his air force was waiting tensely, broomsticks already clutched firmly in their hands. All wings report in, said General Potter. They'd rehearsed this during their one training session on Saturday. Red leader standing by, said Seamus Finnegan, who had no idea what it meant. Red 5 standing by, said Dean Thomas, who'd waited his entire life to say it. Green leader standing by, Theodore Knott said rather stiffly. Green 41 standing by, Tracy Davis said. I want you in the air the instant we hear the bell, said General Potter. Do not engage, repeat, do not engage. Evade if under fire. Of course you did not aim sleep spells at broomsticks, you fired a spell that gave a temporary red glow to whatever it hit. If you hit the broomstick or the rider, they were out of the war. Red leader and Red 5 fly toward Malfoy's army as fast as you can, stay as high as you can while still seeing them, return the instant you know for sure what they're doing. Green leader, do the same for Granger's army. Green 41, fly above us and watch for any approaching broomsticks or soldiers, you and only you are authorized to fire. And remember, I didn't say, Merlin says, for any of that, but we do really need the information. For chaos. For chaos. The 4 echoed with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Harry expected Hermione to launch an immediate attack on Draco, in which case he'd move his troops into position and start supporting her, but only after she'd taken severe losses and caused some damage. He would frame it as a heroic rescue, if possible. It wouldn't do to have Sunshine thinking that Chaos wasn't their friend, after all. But just in case she didn't. Well, that was why the Chaos Legion was staying put until Green Leader reported back. Draco's moves would be in his own self-interest. He would predictably ready his army to defend against Hermione. He might or might not realize that Harry had been lying about waiting to attack until after that battle finished. Harry had still put 2 broomsticks on Dragon Army, just in case they were doing something, and just in case Draco or Mr. Goyle or Mr. Crabbe was good enough to shoot a broomstick out of the sky. But General Granger was the unpredictable one, and Harry couldn't move until he knew how she was moving. In the heart of the forest, with shadow patterns dancing on the ground as leafy canopies swayed high above, General Malfoy stood where the trees were relatively sparser, and looked out on his troops with calm satisfaction. 6 units of 3 troops each, the aerial unit of 4 to which Gregory was assigned, and the command unit, which was himself and Vincent. They'd only drilled for a short time on the previous Saturday, but Draco was confident that he'd managed to explain the basics. Stay with your mates, watch their back and trust them to watch yours. Move as a single body. Obey orders and show no fear. Aim, fire, move, aim again, fire again. The 6 units were formed up in a defensive perimeter around Draco, watchfully gazing outward into the forest. Back to back they stood, wands gripped low until they needed to strike. They already looked remarkably like the Auror units whose training Draco had watched during his father's inspections. Chaos and Sunshine weren't going to know what hit them. Attention, said General Malfoy. The 6 units unfolded and spun toward Draco. The faces of his broomstick riders turned from where they stood with broomsticks already in hand. Draco had decided to wait on demanding salutes until after they won their first battle, when Gryffindors and Hufflepuffs would be more willing to salute a Malfoy. But his soldiers were already standing straight enough, especially the Gryffindors, that Draco wondered if he'd even needed to delay. Gregory had quietly listened, and reported back that Draco's volunteering to stand by Harry Potter in defense class, that time when Professor Quirrell had taught Harry how to lose, had marked Draco as an acceptable commander. At least if you happen to be assigned to his army. Not all Slytherins are alike, there are Slytherins, and then there are Slytherins was what the Gryffindors in Draco's army were quoting to their housemates. Draco was frankly astounded at how incredibly easy that had been. Draco had protested at first about not being assigned any Slytherins, and Professor Quirrell had told him that if he wanted to be the first Malfoy to gain complete political control of the country, he needed to learn how to govern the other 3/4 of the population. It was things like this which reassured Draco that Professor Quirrell had a great deal more sympathy for the good guys than Professor Quirrell was letting on. The actual battle wouldn't be easy, especially if Granger did attack the dragons first. Draco had agonized over whether to commit all his forces against Granger immediately in a preemptive strike, but had worried that 1. Harry had been misleading him completely about what Granger was likely to do, and 2. Harry had been misleading him about waiting until after Granger's attack to join the battle. Though Dragon Army had a secret weapon, 3 of them in fact, which might be enough to win even if they were attacked by both armies at once. It was almost time, and that meant it was time for the pre-battle speech that Draco had composed and memorized. "The battle is about to begin," Draco said. His voice was calm and precise. "Remember everything that I and Mr. Crabbe and Mr. Goyle showed you. An army wins because it is disciplined and deadly. General Potter and the Chaos Legion will not be disciplined. Granger and the Sunshine Regiment will not be deadly. We are disciplined, we are deadly, we are dragons. The battle is about to begin, and we are about to win it." Extempore speech given by General Potter to the Chaos Legion, immediately before their first battle, on November 3, 1991, at 2:56 p.m. Smiley face. "My troops, I'm not going to lie to you, our situation today is very grim. Dragon Army has never lost a single battle. And Hermione Granger has a very good memory. The truth is, most of you are probably going to die. And the survivors will envy the dead. But we have to win this. We have to win this so that someday, our children can enjoy the taste of chocolate again. Everything is at stake here. Literally everything. If we lose, the whole universe just blinks out like a light bulb. And now I realize that most of you don't know what a light bulb is. Well, take it from me, it's bad. But if we have to go down, let's go down fighting, like heroes, so that as the darkness closes in, we can think to ourselves, at least we had fun. Are you afraid to die? I know I am. I can feel those cold shivers of fear like someone is pumping ice cream into my shirt. But I know that history is watching us. It was watching us when we changed into our uniforms. It was probably taking pictures. And history, my troops, is written by the victors. If we win this, we can write our own history. A history in which Hogwarts was founded by 4 renegade house elves. We can make everyone study that history, even though it isn't true, and if they don't answer the right way on our tests, they'll fail the class. Isn't that worth dying for? No, don't answer that. Some things are better left unknown. None of us know why we're here. None of us know why we're fighting. We just woke up in these uniforms in this mysterious forest, knowing only that there was no way to get our names and memories back except victory. The students in those other armies out there, they're just like us. They don't want to die. They're fighting to protect each other, the only friends they have left. They're fighting because they know they have families who will miss them, even if they can't remember now. They may even be fighting to save the world. But we have a better reason to fight than they do. We fight because we like it. We fight to amuse eldritch monstrosities from beyond space and time. We fight because we're chaos. Soon the final battle will begin, so let me say now, because I won't get a chance later, that it was an honor to be your commander, however briefly. Thank you all. And remember, your goal isn't just to cut down the enemy, it's to make them afraid." A great booming gong echoed over the forest. And the Sunshine Regiment began to march. The tension rose and rose, as Harry and the 19 other soldiers who remained waited for the aerial warriors to report back. It shouldn't take long, broomsticks were fast and the distances in the forest were not great. 2 broomsticks approached, at speed, from the direction of Draco's camp, and all the soldiers tensed. They weren't executing the maneuvers that were today's code for a friendly broomstick. "Scatter and fire," roared General Potter, and then suited action to words, scurrying off at top speed toward the forest cover, and then as soon as Harry was among the trees, he spun back, raised his wand, tried to seek out the broomstick in the sky. "Clear," shouted a voice. "They're heading back." Harry gave a mental shrug. There'd been no way to prevent Draco from obtaining that information, and he'd only learned that they'd been standing still. And the Chaotix slowly emerged from the forest. "Broomstick approaching from Granger's direction," yelled another voice. "I think it's Green Leader, he did the dip and roll." Moments later Theodore Nod dived out of the sky and pulled up in the midst of the soldiers. "Granger has divided her forces in 2, yelled Nod as he hovered on his broomstick. There was sweat staining his uniform, and all the reserve was gone from his voice. "She's attacking both armies. 2 brooms covering each force, they pursued me halfway here. Divided her army, what on earth? A large force concentrating fire on a small force could deplete that force rapidly without taking much damage in return. If 20 soldiers faced 10 soldiers, 20 sleep spells would be aimed at the 10 soldiers with only 10 sleep spells going the other way, so unless every one of those first sleep spells hit its target, the smaller force would lose more people than they could manage to take down with them. Defeated in detail was the military term for what happened when you divided your forces like that. What could Hermione possibly be thinking? Then Harry realized. She's being fair. It was going to be a long year in defense class. All right, Harry said loudly, so the army could hear. We'll wait until the Red Wing reports in, and then we'll go cloud up some sunshine. Draco listened to the flyer's reports with his face calm, all his shock concealed inside. What could Granger possibly be thinking? Then Draco realized. It's a feint. One of Sunshine's two forces would change direction, and both would converge on. Who? Neville Longbottom marched through the forest toward the approaching Sunny force, occasionally glancing up at the sky for broomsticks. Beside him marched his squad comrades, Melvin Coote and Lavender Brown of Gryffindor, and Alan Flint of Slytherin. Alan Flint was their squad suggester, though Harry had first said to Neville, in private, that the position was his if he wanted it. Harry had said quite a lot of things to Neville in private, starting with, you know, Neville, if you want to become as awesome as the imaginary Neville who lives in your head but isn't allowed to do anything because you're scared, then you really should sign up for Professor Quirrell's armies. Neville was now sure the boy who lived could read minds. There was just no other way Harry Potter could have known. Neville had never talked about that with anyone, or given any sign, and other people weren't like that, not that Neville had ever noticed. And Harry's promise had come true. This did feel different from sparring in defense class. Neville had hoped that sparring would fix everything that was wrong with him, and, well, it hadn't. Even if he could fire a few spells at another student in class with Professor Quirrell watching to make sure nothing went wrong, even if he could dodge and fire back when it was allowed and everyone else was expecting it and they would stare at him funny if he didn't do it, none of that was the same as being able to stand up for himself. But being part of an army. Something strange was stirring inside Neville, as he marched through the forest alongside his comrades, upon their uniforms and insignia of fingers poised to snap. He was allowed to walk if he wanted to, but he just felt like marching. Beside him, Melvin and Lavender and Alan all seemed to feel like marching too. And Neville softly began to sing the Song of Chaos. The tune was what a Muggle would have identified as John Williams's Imperial March, also known as Darth Vader's theme, and the words Harry had added were easy to remember. Doom doom doom. Doom 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 doom. Doom doom doom. Doom 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 doom. Doom doom doom. Doom 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 doom. Doom 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 doom, doom doom doom. By the second line the others had joined in, and soon you could hear the same soft chant coming from nearby parts of the forest. And Neville marched alongside his fellow Chaos Legionnaires. Strange feelings stirring in his heart. Imagination becoming reality, as from his lips poured a fearful song of doom. Harry stared at the bodies scattered across the forest. Something inside him felt a bit queasy, and he had to remind himself hard that they were only sleeping. There were girls among the fallen, and that made it a lot worse somehow, and he would have to be careful never to mention that in front of Hermione or the Aurors would find his remains stuffed into a small teapot. Half of Sunshine Army hadn't put up much of a fight against all of Chaos. The 9 ground soldiers had run in screaming inarticulately with simple shields raised, circular screens to protect their faces and chests. But you couldn't fire and hold the shield at the same time, and Harry's soldiers had simply aimed for the legs. All but one of the Sunnies had fallen over as soon as the cries of Somnium filled the air. That last one had dropped her shield and managed to take out one of Harry's soldiers before being hit by the second wave of sleep spells. The sleep hex was safe for multiple hits. The 2 Sunny broomsticks had been much harder to take down and had accounted for 3 chaotics before being orayed by massed ground fire. Hermione wasn't among the fallen. Draco must have gotten her, and that was making Harry feel angry on some completely incomprehensible level. He wasn't sure if he was feeling protective toward Hermione, or cheated that he hadn't been the one to do it, or maybe both. All right, Harry said, raising his voice. Let's everyone be clear on one thing, that wasn't a real fight. That was General Granger making a mistake in her first battle. Today's actual fight is with Diagon Army, and it's not going to be anything like this. It's going to be a lot more fun. Let's move out. A broomstick fell out of the sky, approaching terrifyingly fast, and spun on its end and decelerated so hard you could almost hear the air screaming in protest, and came to a halt directly beside Draco. It wasn't dangerous showing off. Gregory Goyle simply was that good, and he didn't waste time. Potter's coming, Gregory said with no trace of his usual fake drawl. They've still got all 4 of their brooms. You want me to take them out? No, Draco said sharply. Fighting over their army gives them too much of an advantage. They'll fire on you from the ground, and even you might not be able to dodge at all. Wait until the forces engage. Draco had lost 4 dragons in exchange for 12 Sunnies. Apparently General Granger actually had been that incredibly stupid, though she hadn't been among the attackers, so Draco hadn't gotten a chance to taunt her or ask her what in Merlin's name she had been thinking. The true battle, they all knew, would be with Harry Potter. Prepare yourselves, roared Draco at his troops. Stay together with your mates, act as a unit, fire as soon as the enemy is in range. Discipline against chaos. It shouldn't be much of a fight. The adrenaline was pumping and pumping into Neville's blood until he felt like he could hardly breathe. We're closing in, said General Potter in a voice barely loud enough to carry to the whole army. Time to spread out. Neville's comrades moved away from him. They would still support each other, but if you clustered together, the enemy would have a much easier time hitting you. Fire aimed at one of your comrades might miss and get you instead. You would be a lot harder to hit if you spread out and moved as fast as you could. The first thing General Potter had done, during their training session, was get them to fire on each other when both sides were running fast, or both stood still and took time to aim, or one was moving and one was standing still. The reverse charm to the sleep hex was simple, though you weren't allowed to use it during real battles. General Potter had carefully recorded everything that happened, done some figuring and ciphering, and then announced that it made more sense for them to focus, not on slowing down to aim carefully, but on moving fast so they wouldn't get hit. It still bothered Neville a little not to be marching side by side with his comrades, but the scary battle cries they'd learned were already thundering in his head, and that made up for a lot. This time, Neville silently vowed to himself, his voice was absolutely positively not going to squeak. "Shields up," said General Potter, "power to forward deflectors." "Contigo," murmured the army, and the circular screens sprang into existence before their heads and chests. A sharp taste filled Neville's mouth. General Potter wouldn't have ordered them to cast shields unless they were almost in range. Neville could see the uniformed shapes of dragons moving through the dense screens of trees, and the dragons would be seeing them as well. "Attack!" came a cry from the distance, the voice of Draco Malfoy, and General Potter bellowed, "Charge!" All the adrenaline in Neville's blood was unleashed, and his legs took over, sending him flying faster than he'd ever run before, straight toward the enemy, knowing without needing to look that all his comrades were doing the same. "Blood for the blood god!" screamed Neville. "Skulls for the skull throne! Ia! Shub Niggurath! The enemy's gate is sideways!" There was a soundless impact as a sleep spell wasted itself against Neville's shield. If there'd been other spells fired, they hadn't hit. Neville saw the brief look of fear on Wayne Hopkins's face, as he stood beside two Gryffindors Neville didn't recognize, and then Neville dropped the simple shield and fired at Wayne. Missed. His racing legs went straight past the enemy grouping and toward another 3 dragons, their wands coming up on him, their mouths opening. Not even thinking about it, Neville dived down to the forest floor just as 3 voices cried, "Somnium." It hurt, hard stones and hard twigs digging into Neville as he rolled. It wasn't as bad as falling off his broomstick, but he'd still hit the ground pretty hard, and then Neville, with sudden insight, lay still and closed his eyes. "Stop that!" screamed a voice. "Don't shoot us, we're dragons." With a flash of glorious satisfaction, Neville realized that he'd managed to get between 2 groups of dragons just as one group had fired on him. Harry had talked about this as a tactic for making the enemy afraid to fire, but apparently it worked a bit better than that. And not only that, the dragons believed they'd gotten him, since they'd seen Neville fall just as they fired. Neville counted to 20 inside his head, then opened his eyes a crack. The 3 dragons were very near him, heads spinning rapidly as cries of "Somnium" and "Skulls for the skull throne" filled the air around them. All 3 had simple shields up now. Neville's wand was still in his hand, and it didn't take much effort to point it at one boy's boots and whisper, "Somnium." Neville quickly closed his eyes and relaxed his hand as he heard the boy fall to the ground. "Where'd it come from?" screamed Justin Finch Fletchley's voice, and Neville heard rustles on the leafy forest floor, as of 2 dragons spinning around looking for an enemy. "Reform ranks!" bellowed Malfoy's voice. "To me, everyone, don't let them scatter you." Neville's ears heard the 2 dragons actually jump over his prone body as they ran off. Neville opened his eyes, pushed himself to his feet a bit painfully, and then pointed his wand and said the new charm that General Potter had taught them all. They couldn't do real illusion spells to confuse the enemy, but even at their age they could. "Ventriloquo," whispered Neville, pointing the wand to one side of Justin and the other boy, and then yelled, "For Cthulhu and glory." Justin and the other boy stopped abruptly, turning their shields toward where Neville had moved his battle cry, and that was when multiple cries of "Somnium" filled the air and the other boy dropped before Neville was finished aiming. "The last one's mine," yelled Neville, and then he started sprinting straight toward Justin, who'd been mean to him until the older Hufflepuff straightened him out. Neville was surrounded by his comrades, and that meant special attack, chaotic leap. Howled Neville as he ran, and felt his body lighten, then lighten twice again, as his comrades got their wands turned toward him and quietly cast the hover charm, and Neville raised his left hand and snapped his fingers and then used his legs to push off the ground as hard as he could and soared through the air. Sheer shock painted Justin's face as Neville went over the other boy's shield and pointed his wand down at the form passing beneath him and cried, "Somnium." Because he'd felt like it, that was why. Neville didn't quite get his feet turned around properly and rather plowed into the ground as he landed, but 2 out of 3 of the other Chaos Legionnaires had managed to hold their wands on him throughout and he didn't hit very hard. And Neville got to his feet, panting. He knew he should be moving, people were yelling, "Somnium" all over the place. "I am Neville, the last scion of Longbottom," screamed Neville to the sky above, holding his wand pointed straight up as though to challenge the blazing blue heaven itself, knowing that nothing after this day would ever be the same again. "Neville of Chaos, face me if you daw." When Neville woke up afterward, he was told that Dragon Army had taken this as their cue to counterattack. The girl beside Harry slumped to the ground, taking the shot meant for him, and he could hear Mr. Goyle's distant gloating laugh as his broomstick blasted past them, cutting the air so hard it should have shattered in his wake. Luminous! Cried one of the boys next to Harry, who hadn't been able to rebuild the magical strength fast enough to do it earlier, and Mr. Goyle dodged it without a pause. Chaos had only 6 soldiers left now, and Dragon Army had 2, and the only problem was that one of those soldiers was invincible, and the other one was using up 3 soldiers just to cover him inside his shield. They'd lost more soldiers to Mr. Goyle than all the other dragons put together. He was weaving and dodging through the air so fast that no one could hit him, and he could shoot people while he did that. Harry had thought of all sorts of ways to stop Mr. Goyle, but none of them were safe. Even using the hover charm to slow him down, it was a continuous beam and much easier to aim, wouldn't be safe because he might fall off the broomstick. Throwing things in his way wouldn't be safe, and that was getting harder and harder to remember as Harry's blood froze over. It's a game. You're not trying to kill him. Don't throw away all your future plans for a game. Harry could see the pattern, he could see how Mr. Goyle was weaving, he could see how and when they all needed to fire in order to create a web of shots that Mr. Goyle wouldn't be able to dodge, but he just hadn't been able to explain it fast enough to his soldiers. They couldn't coordinate their shots well enough, and now they didn't have enough people left to do it. I refuse to lose, not like this, not my whole army to one soldier. Mr. Goyle's broomstick turned faster than anything should have been able to turn and started to angle in toward Harry and his surviving troops. He could sense the boy beside him tensing, getting ready to throw himself in front of his general. Screw this. Harry's wand came up, focusing on Mr. Goyle. Harry's mind visualized the pattern, and Harry's lips opened and his voice screamed. Luminos, 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 luminos. When Harry's eyes opened again, he found himself resting in a comfortable position with his hands folded over his chest, holding his wand like a fallen hero. Slowly, Harry sat up. His magic was aching, a strange sensation but not an entirely unpleasant one, much like the burn and lethargy that followed hard physical exercise. The general's awake, cried a voice, and Harry blinked and focused in that direction. 4 of his soldiers held their wands on a shimmering prismatic hemisphere, and Harry realized that the battle wasn't over. Right. He hadn't been hit by a sleep hex, just exhausted himself, so when he woke up, he was still in the game. Harry suspected he was going to get a lecture from someone or other about not exhausting his magic to the point of unconsciousness over a children's game. But he hadn't hurt Mr. Goyle when he'd lost his temper, and that was the important thing. Then Harry's mind clicked on another implication, and he looked down at the steel ring on his left hand's pinky finger, and almost swore out loud when he saw that the tiny diamond was missing and there was a marshmallow lying on the ground near where he'd fallen. He'd sustained the transfiguration for 17 days, and would now need to start over. Could have been worse. He could have done this 14 days later, after Professor McGonagall had approved him to transfigure his father's rock. That was one very good lesson to learn the easy way. Note to self, always remove ring from finger before completely exhausting magic. Harry pushed himself up, making rather hard going of it. Using up your magic didn't exhaust your muscles, but dodging around trees certainly did. He staggered over to the iridescent hemisphere that contained Draco Malfoy, who was holding his wand aloft to sustain the shield, and smiling coldly at Harry. Where's the 5th soldier? Said Harry. Said a boy whose name Harry couldn't remember at the moment. I fired a sleep hex at the shield and it bounced off and hit Lavender. I mean the angle shouldn't have been right but it did. Draco was smirking inside the shield. So let me guess, Harry said, looking Draco directly in the eyes. Those neat little trios are the formation used by professional magical militaries. Made up of trained soldiers who can easily hit moving targets if their own hands are steady, and who can combine their defensive powers so long as they stay together. Unlike your soldiers. The smirk had vanished from Draco's face, which was now hard and grim. You know, Harry said lightly, knowing that none of the others would understand the real message passing between them. It just goes to show that you should always question everything you see your role models doing, and ask why it's being done, and whether it makes sense in context for you to do it too. Don't forget to apply that advice to real life, by the way. And thanks for the slow-moving cluster targets. Because Draco had already gotten that lecture, and, Harry suspected, discounted it out of suspicion that Harry was trying to shift his loyalties further away from pureblood tradition. Which of course Harry was. But this example would make an excellent excuse, next Saturday, to claim that questioning authority was a merely practical technique for real life. And Harry would also mention the experiments he'd run, first with individuals and then with groups, to check that his ideas about the importance of speed had actually been correct, by way of hammering home the point of Draco needing to keep an eye out at all times for chances to apply the methods in everyday practice. You haven't won yet, General Potter, snarled Draco. Maybe we'll run out of time, and Professor Quirrell will call it a draw. A fair and worrisome point. The war only ended when Professor Quirrell, in his personal judgment, decided one army had won by practical real-world standards. There was no formal victory condition, Professor Quirrell had explained, because then Harry would figure out how to game the rules. Harry had to admit this was a fair cop. And Harry couldn't blame Professor Quirrell for not calling an end, because it was plausible that the last soldier of Diagon Army could take out all 5 survivors of the Chaos Legion. All right, Harry said. Does anyone know anything about General Malfoy's shield spell? It developed that Draco's shield was a version of the standard Protega which had several disadvantages, the most important of which was that the shield couldn't move with the caster. The upside, or from Harry's perspective, downside, was that it was easier to learn, easier to cast, and much easier to sustain for long times. They would need to hammer the shield with attack spells in order to bring it down. And Draco could apparently exert some control over the angle of reflection at which the spells would bounce off. The thought occurred to Harry that they could use Wingardium Leviosa to pile up heavy rocks on the shield until Draco couldn't sustain it against the pressure. But then the rocks might fall in afterward and hit Draco, and injuring the enemy general for real was not among today's goals. So, said Harry, are there such things as specialized shield-piercing spells? There were. Harry asked if any of his soldiers knew them. No one did. Draco was smirking again, inside his shield. Harry asked if there was any sort of attack spell that wouldn't bounce. Lightning bolts, it seemed, were usually absorbed by shields instead of bouncing off them. No one knew how to cast any sort of lightning-related spell. Draco sniggered. Harry sighed. He quite deliberately laid his wand on the ground. And Harry announced, with some weariness in his voice, that he would just go ahead and take down the shield himself, using some method that would remain mysterious, and everyone else was to fire on Draco as soon as his shield went down. The Chaos Legionnaires looked nervous. Draco looked calm, which was to say, controlled. A thin, folded blanket came out of Harry's pouch. Harry sat down next to the shimmering shield, and pulled the blanket over his head so no one could see what he did, except Draco, of course. From Harry's pouch came a car battery and a set of jumper cables. It wasn't like he'd been about to leave the Muggle world to start a new era of magical research, and not take along any way of generating electricity. Shortly after, the Chaos Legionnaires heard the sound of fingers snapping, followed by a crackling noise from beneath the blanket. The shield started glowing more brightly, and Harry's voice said, "Don't be distracted please, eyes on General Malfoy." The strain was showing on Draco's face, along with the fury and annoyance and frustration. Harry smiled up at him, and mouthed, "Tell you later." And that was when a spiral of green energy shot out of the forest and smashed into Draco's shield, which shrieked like pieces of sharp glass being rubbed together, and Draco staggered. In sudden, frantic panic, Harry took the jumper cables off the battery and fed them into the pouch, then he fed the battery itself into the pouch, and then he tore off the blanket and grabbed his wand and stood up. All of his soldiers were still there and glancing around frantically. "Contigo," Harry said, and his soldiers followed suit, but Harry didn't even know which direction the shield ought to be pointing in. Did anyone see where that came from? Shaken heads. And General Malfoy, would you mind telling me if you got General Granger? Why yes, Draco said acidly, I mind. Oh, hell. Harry's mind began calculating, Draco inside the shield, Draco worn out now to some degree, Harry worn out too, Hermione in the woods who knew where, Harry and 4 other chaotics left. You know, General Granger, Harry said out loud, you really should have waited to attack until after I'd fought General Malfoy. You might have been able to get all the survivors. From somewhere came a girl's high-pitched laughter. Harry froze. That wasn't Hermione. And that was when the dreadful, eerie, cheerful chant began to rise, coming from all around them. Don't be frightened, don't be sad, we'll only hurt you if you're bad. Granger cheated. Burst out Draco inside the shield. She woke up her soldiers. Why doesn't Professor Quirrell? Let me guess, Harry said, the sickness already churning in his stomach. He really hated losing. It was a very easy battle, right? They dropped like flies. Yes, Draco said, we got them all on the first shot. The look of horrified realization spread from Draco to the Chaos Legionnaires. No, Harry said, we didn't. Camouflaged forms were appearing from among the trees. Allies, Harry said. Allies, Draco said. Good, said General Granger's voice, and a spiral of green energy blazed out of the woods and shattered Draco's shield to splinters. General Granger surveyed the battlefield with a definite feeling of satisfaction. She was down to 9 Sunshine soldiers, but that was probably enough to handle the last survivor of the enemy forces, especially when Parvati and Anthony and Ernie were already holding their wands on General Potter, whom she'd ordered taken alive, well, conscious. It was bad, she knew, but she'd really wanted to gloat. There's a trick, isn't there? Said Harry, the strain showing in his voice. There has to be some trick. You can't just turn into a perfect general. Not on top of everything else. You're not that Slytherin. You don't write creepy poetry. No one's that good at everything. General Granger glanced around at her Sunshine soldiers, and then looked back at Harry. Everyone was probably watching this on the screens outside. And General Granger said, I can do anything if I study hard enough. Oh, now that's just you. Somnium. Harry slumped to the ground in mid-sentence. Sunshine wins, intoned the huge voice of Professor Quirrell, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. Niceness has triumphed, cried General Granger. Hooray, shouted the Sunshine soldiers. Even the Gryffindor boys said it, and they said it with pride. And what's the moral of today's battle? Said General Granger. We can do anything if we study hard enough. And the survivors of the Sunshine Regiment marched off toward the victory field, singing their marching song as they went. Don't be frightened, don't be sad. We'll only hurt you if you're bad. And send you to a home that's true. With new friends to watch over you. Be sure to tell them you were sent by Granger's Sunshine Regiment. 31. Working in groups, PT2. Aftermaths. Harry paced backward and forward in his general's office, which made a wonderful room for pacing. It didn't have any other uses as far as he could tell. How? Hermione shouldn't have won that battle. Not on her first try, not when she wasn't at all violent by her nature. Automatically being a great military commander on top of everything else was too much even for her. Had she read about the tactic in a military history book? But it hadn't been just that one tactic. She'd had her forces perfectly positioned to block any retreat. Her troops had been better coordinated than his or Draco's. Had Professor Quirrell broken his promise not to help her? Had he given her the diary of General Tacticus or something? Harry was missing something here, something really important, and his mind went around and around in circles, and he still couldn't figure it out. Finally Harry sighed. He wasn't getting anywhere on this, and he had to go learn the breaking drill hex from Hermione or someone before the next battle. Professor Quirrell had explained to Harry, his voice amused but with a sharp undertone of warning, that no magical items except the ones I give you, included Muggle technology no matter how much that wasn't magic. Plus Harry also needed to figure out how to bring down Mr. Goyle next time. Battles counted for a lot of Quirrell points if you were a general, and Harry needed to get cracking if he wanted to win Professor Quirrell's Christmas wish. In his private room at Slytherin, Draco Malfoy stared off into space, as though the wall in front of his desk was the most fascinating surface in the world. How? In retrospect it had been an obvious sort of idea as cunning plots went, but Granger wasn't supposed to be cunning. She'd been too much of a Hufflepuff to use a simple strike hex. Had Professor Quirrell been advising her despite his promise, or... And then Draco finally did what he should have done much earlier. What he should have done after the first time he met with Granger. What Harry Potter had told him to do, trained him to do, and yet Harry had also warned Draco that it would take time to make his brain realize that the methods applied to real life, and Draco hadn't understood that until today. He could have avoided every single one of his mistakes if he'd just applied the things Harry had already told him. Draco said out loud, I notice that I am confused. Your strength as a rationalist is your ability to be more confused by fiction than by reality. Draco was confused. Therefore, something he believed was fiction. Granger should not have been able to do all that. Therefore, she probably hadn't. I promise not to help General Granger in any way that the two of you don't know about. With sudden horrified realization, Draco swept papers out of the way, hunting through the mess on his desk, until he found it. And there it was. Right in the list of people and equipment assigned to each of the 3 armies. Curse Professor Quirrell. Draco had read it and he still hadn't seen it. The afternoon sunlight poured down into the office of the Sunshine Regiment, illuminating General Granger in her chair as though she glowed with a golden aura. How long do you think it will take Malfoy to figure it out? Said General Granger. Not long, said Colonel Blaise Zabini. He may have already. How long will it take Potter to figure it out? Forever, said General Granger, unless Malfoy tells him, or one of his own soldiers realizes. Harry Potter just doesn't think like that. Really? Said Captain Ernie Macmillan, looking up from one of the corner tables where he was being crushed at chess by Captain Ron Weasley. They'd brought back all the other chairs after Malfoy had left, of course. I mean, it seems kind of obvious to me. Who would try to come up with all the ideas just by themselves? Harry, said Hermione, at exactly the same time Zabini said, Malfoy. Malfoy thinks he's way better than everyone else, said Zabini. And Harry doesn't really see most other people like that, said Hermione. It was kind of sad, actually. Harry had grown up very, very alone. It wasn't that he went around thinking in words that only geniuses had a right to exist. It just wouldn't occur to him that anyone in Hermione's army besides Hermione could have any good ideas. Anyhow, Hermione said, Captains Goldstein and Weasley, you're on duty for thinking up strategic ideas for our next battle. Captains Macmillan and Susan, Macmillan and Bones, try to come up with some tactics we can use, also any training you think we should try. Oh, and congratulations on your marching song, Captain Goldstein. I think it was a big plus for esprit de corps. What are you doing? Said Susan. And Colonel Zabini. Hermione stood up out of her chair, stretching. I'll try to figure out what Harry Potter is thinking, and Colonel Zabini will try to figure out what Draco Malfoy might do, and both of us will join you again after we come up with something. I'm going to walk while I think. Zabini, you want to come along? Yes, General, said Zabini stiffly. It hadn't been meant as an order. Hermione sighed to herself a little. This was going to take some getting used to, and although Zabini's first idea had certainly worked, she wasn't quite sure that Professor Quirrell's quote mixture of positive and negative incentives unquote would be enough to keep the Slytherin fully on her side until December, when traitors would be allowed for the first time. She still had no idea what she was going to do with Professor Quirrell's Christmas wish, either. Maybe she'd just ask Mandy if she wanted anything, when the time came around. 32. Interlude, Personal Financial Management. But Headmaster, Harry argued, some of his desperation leaking into his voice, leaving all of my assets in one undiversified vault full of gold coins. It's crazy, Headmaster. It's like, I don't know, doing transfiguration experiments without consulting a recognized authority. You just don't do that with money. From the lined face of the old wizard, underneath a festive holiday hat like a catastrophic automobile collision between cars of green and red cloth, a grave, sad look peered out at Harry. I'm sorry, Harry, said Dumbledore, and I do apologize, but allowing you control over your own finances would give you far too much independence of action. Harry's mouth opened and no sound came out. He was, literally, speechless. I will permit you to withdraw 5 galleons for Christmas presents, said Dumbledore, which is more than any boy your age should spend, but poses no threat, I think. I can't believe you just said that. The words burst out of Harry's mouth. You admit to being that manipulative. Manipulative, said the old wizard, smiling slightly. No, manipulative would be if I did not admit it, or if I had some deeper motive behind the obvious. This is quite straightforward, Harry. You are not yet ready to play the game, and it would be foolish to allow you thousands of galleons with which to upset the game board. The bright hustle and bustle of Diagon Alley had increased by 100-fold and redoubled as Christmas approached, with all the shops enshrouded in brilliant sorceries that flashed and sparkled as though the season's spirit was about to blaze out of control and turn the whole area into a cheerful holiday crater. The streets were so crowded with witches and wizards in festive and loud clothing that your eyes were assaulted almost as severely as your ears, and it was clear, from the bewildering variety of the shoppers, that Diagon Alley was considered an international attraction. There were witches wrapped in giant swaths of cloth like toweled mummies, and wizards in formal top hats and bath robes, and young children barely past toddling age who were decorated with lights that blazed almost as bright as the shops themselves, as their parents took them hand in hand through that magic wonderland and let them shriek to their heart's content. It was the season to be merry. And in the midst of all that light and cheer, a note of blackest night, a cold, dark atmosphere that cleared a few precious paces of distance even in the midst of all that crush. No, said Professor Quirrell, with a look of grim revulsion, like he'd just bitten into food that not only tasted horrible but was morally repugnant to boot. It was the sort of grim face an ordinary person might make after biting into a meat pie, and discovering that it was rotten and had been made from kittens. Oh, come on, Harry said. You must have some ideas. Mr. Potter, Professor Quirrell said, his lips set in a thin line, I agreed to act as your adult guardian on this expedition. I did not agree to advise you on your choice of presents. I don't do Christmas, Mr. Potter. How about Newtonmas? Harry said brightly. Isaac Newton actually was born on December 25th, unlike some other historical figures I could name. This failed to impress Professor Quirrell. Look, said Harry, I'm sorry, but I've got to do something special for Fred and George and I've got no idea of my options. Professor Quirrell made a thoughtful humming sound. You could ask which family members they most dislike, and then hire an assassin. I know someone from a certain government in exile who is quite competent, and he would give you a discount on multiple Weasleys. This Christmas, Harry said, dropping his voice into a lower register, give your friends the gift of death. That made Professor Quirrell smile. It went all the way to his eyes. Well, said Harry, at least you didn't suggest getting them a pet rat. Harry's mouth snapped shut, and he was regretting the words almost as soon as they were out of his mouth. Pardon me, said Professor Quirrell. Nothing, Harry said at once, long dumb story. And telling it seemed wrong somehow, maybe because Harry was afraid Professor Quirrell would have laughed even if Bill Weasley hadn't been cured and everything put back to right. And where had Professor Quirrell been that he'd never heard the story? Harry had gotten the impression that everyone in magical Britain knew. Look, said Harry, I'm trying to solidify their loyalty to me, you know. Make the Weasley twins my minions. Like the old saying goes, a friend isn't someone you use once and then throw away, a friend is someone you use over and over again. Fred and George are 2 of the most useful friends I have in Hogwarts, Professor Quirrell, and I plan to use them over and over again. So if you'd help me be Slytherin here, and suggest something they might be very grateful for. Harry's voice trailed off invitingly. You just had to pitch these things the right way. They walked on for a good way before Professor Quirrell spoke again, his voice practically dripping with distaste. The Weasley twins are using second-hand wands, Mr. Potter. They would be reminded of your generosity with every charm they cast. Harry clapped his hands together in involuntary excitement. Just put the money on account at Ollivander's, and tell Mr. Ollivander to never refund it. No, better yet, to send it to Lucius Malfoy if the Weasley twins didn't show up before the start of their next school year. That's brilliant, Professor. Professor Quirrell did not look like he appreciated the compliment. I suppose I can tolerate Christmas in that spirit, Mr. Potter, though only barely. Then he smiled slightly. Of course that will cost you 14 galleons, and you only have 5. 5 galleons, Harry said, with a sniff of outrage. Just who does the headmaster think he's dealing with, anyway? I think, said Professor Quirrell, that it simply did not occur to him to fear the consequences if you turned your ingenuity to the task of obtaining funds. Though you were wise to lose, rather than making it an explicit threat. Out of curiosity, Mr. Potter, what would you have done if I hadn't turned away in boredom while you, in a fit of childish pique, counted out 5 galleons worth of nuts? Well, the easiest way would have been to borrow money from Draco Malfoy, said Harry. Professor Quirrell chuckled briefly. Seriously, Mr. Potter. Duly noted. Probably I'd have done a few celebrity appearances. I wouldn't resort to anything economically disruptive just for spending money. Harry had checked, and he would be allowed to keep the time turner while he went home for the holidays, so that his sleep cycle didn't start to rotate. But then it was also possible that someone kept an eye out for magical day traders. The gold and silver trick would have taken work on the Muggle end, and seed funding, and the goblins might have gotten suspicious after the first cycle. And starting a real bank would be a lot of work. Harry hadn't quite worked out any money-making methods that were fast and certain and safe, so he'd been very glad when Professor Quirrell had turned out to be so easily fooled. I do hope those 5 galleons will be enough to last, since you counted them so carefully, said Professor Quirrell. I doubt the headmaster shall be so eager to entrust me with your vault key a second time, once he discovers I've been tricked. I'm sure you did your best, Harry said with deep gratitude. Do you need any assistance finding a safe place to store all those nuts, Mr. Potter? Well, sort of, said Harry. Do you know of any good investment opportunities, Professor Quirrell? And the two of them walked on, in their tiny sphere of silence and isolation, through the brilliant and bustling crowds, and if you looked carefully, you would see that where they went, leafy boughs faded, and flowers withered, and children's toys that played cheerful bells changed to lower and more ominous notes. Harry did notice, but he didn't say anything, just smiled a little to himself. Everyone had their own way of celebrating the holidays, and the Grinch was as much a part of Christmas as Santa. 33. Coordination problems, PT1. I just recite to myself, over and over, until I can choose sleep. It all adds up to J.K. Rowling. The version of decision theory used in this chapter is not the academically dominant one. It's based on something called timeless decision theory, that's under development by, among others, Gary Drescher, Wei Dai, Vladimir Nasov, and, well, coughs a few times, me. The terrifying part was how fast the whole thing had spiraled out of control. Albus, Minerva said, not even trying to keep the worry out of her voice as the two of them entered the Great Hall. Something has to be done. The atmosphere at Hogwarts before Yuletide was usually bright and cheerful. The Great Hall had already been decorated in green and red, after a Slytherin and a Gryffindor whose Yule wedding had become a symbol of friendship transcending houses and allegiances, a tradition almost as ancient as Hogwarts itself and which had even spread to Muggle countries. Now the students eating dinner were glancing nervously over their shoulders, or sending vicious glares at other tables, or at some tables arguing heatedly. You could have described the atmosphere as tense, perhaps, but the phrase coming to Minerva's mind was fifth degree of caution. Take a school, into 4 houses divided. Now into each year, add 3 armies at war. And the partisanship of Dragon and Sunshine and Chaos had spread beyond the first years, they had become the armies for those who had no armies. Students were wearing armbands with insignia of fire or smile or upraised hand, and hexing each other in the corridors. All 3 first-year generals had told them to stop, even Draco Malfoy had heard her out and then nodded grimly, but their supposed followers hadn't listened. Dumbledore gazed out at the tables with a distant look. In every city, the old wizard quoted softly, the population has been divided for a long time past into the blue and the green factions. And they fight against their opponents knowing not for what end they imperil themselves. So there grows up in them against their fellow men a hostility which has no cause, and at no time does it cease or disappear, for it gives place neither to the ties of marriage nor of relationship nor of friendship, and the case is the same even though those who differ with respect to these colors be brothers or any other kin. I, for my part, am unable to call this anything except a disease of the soul. I'm sorry, said Minerva, I don't. Procopius, said Dumbledore, they took their chariot racing very seriously, in the Roman Empire. Yes, Minerva, I agree that something must be done. Soon, Minerva said, her voice lowering even further. Albus, I think it must be done before Saturday. On Sunday, most students would leave Hogwarts to stay the holiday with their families. Saturday, then, was the final battle of the 3 first-year armies that would determine the awarding of Professor Quirrell's thrice-cursed Christmas wish. Dumbledore glanced over at her, studying her gravely. You fear that the explosion will come then, and someone will be hurt. Minerva nodded. And that Professor Quirrell will be blamed. Minerva nodded again, her face tight. She had long since become wise in the ways that defense professors were fired. Albus, Minerva said, we cannot lose Professor Quirrell now, we cannot. If he but stays through January our 5th years will pass their L's, if he stays through March our 7th years will pass their Newts, he is remedying years of neglect in months, a whole generation will grow up able to defend themselves in spite of the Dark Lord's curse, you must stop the battle, Albus. Ban the armies now. I am not sure the defense professor would take that kindly, said Dumbledore, glancing over toward the head table where Quirrell was drooling into his soup. He did seem most attached to his armies, though when I agreed I thought there would be 4 in each year. The old wizard sighed. A clever man, probably with the best of intentions, but perhaps not clever enough, I fear. And to ban the armies might also trigger the explosion. But then Albus, what will you do? The old wizard favored her with a benign smile. Why, I shall plot, of course. It's the new fashion in Hogwarts. And they had come too close to the head table for Minerva to say anything more. The terrifying part was how fast the whole thing had spiraled out of control. The first battle in December had been messy, or so Draco had heard. The second battle had been deranged. And the next one would be worse, unless the 3 of them together succeeded in their last desperate attempt to stop it. Professor Quirrell, this is insanity, Draco said flatly. This isn't Slytherin anymore, it's just. Draco was at a loss for words. He waved his hands helplessly. You can't possibly do any real plots with all this stuff going on. Last battle, one of my soldiers faked his own suicide. We have Hufflepuffs trying to plot, and they think they can, but they can't. Things just happen at random now, it doesn't have anything to do with who's cleverest, or which army fights best, it's. He couldn't even describe it. I agree with Mr. Malfoy, said Granger in the tones of someone who hadn't ever expected to hear herself saying those words. Allowing traitors isn't working, Professor Quirrell. Draco had tried forbidding anyone in his army to plot except him, and that had just driven the plots underground. No one wanted to be left out when the soldiers in other armies got to plot. After miserably losing their last battle, he'd finally given in and revoked his decree, but by then his soldiers had already started setting their own personal plans in motion, without any sort of central coordination. After being told all the plans, or what his soldiers claimed were their plans, Draco had tried to sketch a plot to win the final battle. It had required considerably more than 3 different things to go right, and Draco had used Incendio on the paper and Everdo to vanish the ashes, because if Father had seen it he would have been disowned. Professor Quirrell's eyelids were half closed, his chin resting on his hands as he leaned forward onto his desk. And you, Mr. Potter, said the defense professor, are you likewise in agreement? All we'd need to do is shoot Franz Ferdinand and we could start World War I, said Harry. It's gone to complete chaos. I'm all for it. Harry, said Draco in utter shock. He didn't even realize until a second later that he'd said it at exactly the same time, and in exactly the same tone of indignation, as Granger. Granger shot him a startled glance, and Draco carefully kept his face neutral. Oops. That's right, said Harry. I'm betraying you. Both of you. Again. Ha ha. Professor Quirrell was smiling thinly, though his eyes were still half closed. And why is that, Mr. Potter? Because I think I can cope with the chaos better than Miss Granger or Mr. Malfoy, said the traitor. Our war is a zero-sum game, and it doesn't matter whether it's easy or hard in an absolute sense, only who does better or worse. Harry Potter was learning far too fast. Professor Quirrell's eyes moved beneath their lids to regard Draco, and then Granger. In truth, Mr. Malfoy, Miss Granger, I simply could not live with myself if I shut down the grand debacle before its climax. One of your soldiers has even become a quadruple agent. Quadruple, said Granger. But there's only 3 sides in the war. Yes, said Professor Quirrell, you'd think that, wouldn't you? I am not sure that there has ever in history been a quadruple agent, or any army with such a high fraction of real and pretended traitors. We are exploring new realms, Miss Granger, and we cannot turn back now. Draco left the defense professor's office with his teeth gritting hard against each other, and Granger looking even more annoyed beside him. I can't believe you did that, Harry, said Granger. Sorry, Harry said, not sounding sorry at all, his lips curved up in a merry smile of evil. Remember, Hermione, it is just a game, and why should generals like us be the only ones who get to plot? And besides, what are the 2 of you going to do about it? Team up against me. Draco traded glances with Granger, knowing that his own face was as tight as hers. Harry had been relying, more and more openly and gloatingly, on Draco's refusal to make common cause with a mudblood girl, and Draco was beginning to get sick of having that used against him. If this kept up much longer, he was going to ally with Granger just to crush Harry Potter, and see how much the son of a mudblood liked that. The terrifying part was how fast the whole thing had spiraled out of control. Hermione stared at the parchment Zabini had given her, feeling utterly and completely helpless. There were names, and lines connecting the names to other names, and some of the lines were in different colors and… "Tell me," said General Granger, "is there anyone in my army who isn't a spy?" The two of them weren't in the office but in another, deserted classroom, and they were alone, because Colonel Zabini had said, it was now nearly certain that at least one of the captains was a traitor. Probably Captain Goldstein, but Zabini didn't know for sure. Her question had put an ironic smile on the young Slytherin's face. Blaise Zabini always seemed a little disdainful of her, but he didn't seem to actively dislike her, nothing like the derision he held for Draco Malfoy, or the resentment he had developed for Harry Potter. She had worried at first about Zabini betraying her, but the boy seemed desperate to show that the other two generals were no better than him, and Hermione thought that while Zabini would probably be happy to sell her out to anyone else, he'd never let Malfoy or Harry win. "Most of your soldiers are still loyal to you, I'm pretty sure," said Zabini. "It's just that no one wants to be left out of the fun." The scornful look on the Slytherin's face made it clear what he thought of people who didn't take plotting seriously. "So they think they can be double agents and secretly work for our side while pretending to betray us. And that would also go for anyone in the other armies who says they want to be our spy," Hermione said carefully. The young Slytherin shrugged. "I think I did a good job of telling which ones really want to sell out Malfoy. I'm not sure anyone really wants to sell out Potter to you. But not as a sure bet for betraying Potter to Malfoy, and since I had Entwistle approach him supposedly on behalf of Malfoy and Entwistle really reports to us, that's almost as good." Hermione closed her eyes for a moment. "We're going to lose, aren't we?" "Look," Zabini said patiently, "you're in the lead right now on Quirrell points. We just have to not lose this last battle completely and you'll have enough Quirrell points to win the Christmas wish." Professor Quirrell had announced that the final battle would operate on a formal scoring system, which he'd been asked to do to avoid recriminations afterward. Each time you shot someone, the general of your army got 2 Quirrell points. A gong would ring through the battle area. They didn't know yet where they would be fighting, though Hermione was hoping for the forest again, where Sunshine did well, and its pitch would tell which army had won the points. And if anyone was faking being hit, the gong would ring out anyway, and then a double gong would ring later, after no fixed time, to hail the retraction. And if you called the name of an army, cried, for Sunshine, or for Chaos, or for Dragon, it switched your allegiance to that army. Even Hermione had been able to see the flaw in that set of rules. But Professor Quirrell had gone on to announce that if you'd been originally assigned to Sunshine, nobody could shoot you in the name of Sunshine, or rather, they could, but then Sunshine lost a single Quirrell point, symbolized by a triple gong. That prevented you from shooting your own soldiers for points, and discouraged suiciding before the enemy got you, but you could still shoot spies if you had to. Right now, Hermione had 244 Quirrell points, and Malfoy had 219, and Harry had 221, and there were 24 soldiers in each army. "So we fight carefully," Hermione said, "and just try not to lose too badly." "No," said Zabini. The young Slytherin's face was now serious. "The problem is, Malfoy and Potter both know that their only way to win is to combine and crush us, then fight it out on their own. So here's what I think we should do." Hermione left the classroom in something of a daze. Zabini's plan hadn't been the obvious one, it had been strange and complicated and layered and the sort of thing she would have expected Harry to come up with, not Zabini. It felt wrong just for her to be able to understand a plan like that. Young girls shouldn't be able to understand plans like that. The hat would have sorted her into Slytherin, if it had seen that she could understand plans like that. The awesome thing was how fast he'd been able to escalate the chaos once he started doing it deliberately. Harry sat in his office. He'd been given the authority to order furniture from the house elves, so he'd ordered a throne, and curtains in a black and crimson pattern. Scarlet light like blood, mixed with shadow, poured over the floor. Something in Harry felt like he'd finally come home. Before him stood the 4 lieutenants of chaos, his most trusted minions, one of whom was a traitor. This was what life should be like. "We are gathered," said Harry. "Let chaos reign," chorused his 4 lieutenants. "My hovercraft is full of eels," said Harry. "I will not buy this record, it is scratched," chorused his 4 lieutenants. "All mimsy were the Borogroves. And the Mome Raths out grave." That concluded the formalities. "How goes the confusion?" Harry said in a dry whisper like Emperor Palpatine. "It goes well, General Chaos," said Neville in the tone he always used for military matters, a tone so deep that the boy often had to stop and cough. The chaotic lieutenant was neatly dressed in his black school robes, trimmed in the yellow of Hufflepuff House, and his hair was parted and combed in the usual look for an earnest young boy. Harry had liked the incongruity better than any of the cloaks they'd tried. "Our legionnaires have begun 5 new plots since yesterday evening." Harry smiled evilly. "Do any of them have a chance of working?" I don't think so, said Neville of Chaos. Here's the report. Excellent, said Harry, and laughed chillingly as he took the parchment from Neville's hand, trying his best to make it sound like he was choking on dust. That brought the total to 60. Let Draco try to handle that. Let him try. And as for Blaze Zabini. Harry laughed again, and this time it didn't even take an effort to sound evil. He really needed to borrow someone's pet Kneasel for his staff meetings, so he'd have a cat to stroke while he did this. Can the Legion stop making plots now? Said Finnegan of Chaos. I mean, don't we have enough already? No, Harry said flatly. We can never have enough plots. Professor Quirrell had put it perfectly. They were pushing the boundaries further, perhaps, than they had ever been pushed, and Harry wouldn't have been able to live with himself if he'd turned back now. There came a knock at the door. That will be the Dragon General, Harry said, smiling with evil prescience. He arrives precisely as I expected. Do show him in, and yourselves out. And the 4 lieutenants of Chaos shuffled out, casting dark looks at Draco as the enemy general entered into Harry's secret lair. If he wasn't allowed to do this when he was older, Harry was just going to stay 11 forever. The sun was dripping through the red curtains, sending rays of blood dancing across the floor from behind Harry Potter's grown-up sized cushioned chair, which he had covered in gold and silver glitter and insisted on referring to as his throne. Draco was beginning to feel a lot more confident that he'd done the right thing in deciding to overthrow Harry Potter before he could take over the world. Draco couldn't even imagine what it would be like to live under his rule. Good evening, Dragon General, said Harry Potter in a chill whisper. You have arrived just as I expected. This was not surprising, considering that Draco and Harry had agreed on the meeting time in advance. And it also wasn't evening, but by now Draco knew better than to say anything. General Potter, Draco said with as much dignity as he could manage, you know that our 2 armies have to work together for either of us to win Professor Quirrell's wish, right? Yes, hissed Harry, like the boy thought he was a parcelmouth. We must cooperate to destroy Sunshine, and only then fight it out between us. But if one of us betrays the other earlier on, that one could gain an advantage in the later fight. And the Sunshine General, who knows all this, will try to trick each of us into thinking the other has betrayed them. And you and I, who know that, will be tempted to betray the other and pretend that it is Granger's trickery. And Granger knows that, as well. Draco nodded. That much was obvious. And both of us only want to win, and there's no one else who will punish either of us if we defect. Precisely, said Harry Potter, his face now turning serious. We are faced with a true prisoner's dilemma. The prisoner's dilemma, according to Harry's teachings, ran thus: 2 prisoners had been locked in separate cells. There was evidence against each prisoner, but only minor evidence, enough for a prison sentence of 2 years apiece. Each prisoner could opt to defect, betray the other, testify against them in court, and this would take 1 year off their own prison sentence but add 2 years to the others. Or a prisoner could cooperate, staying silent. So if both prisoners defected, each testifying against the other, they would serve 3 years apiece. If both cooperated, or stayed silent, they would serve 2 years each, but if one defected and the other cooperated, the defector would serve a single year, and the cooperator would serve 4. And both prisoners had to make their decision without knowing the other one's choice, and neither would be given a chance to change their decision afterward. Draco had observed that if the 2 prisoners had been Death Eaters during the Wizarding War, the Dark Lord would have killed any traitors. Harry had nodded and said that was one way to resolve the prisoner's dilemma, and in fact both Death Eaters would want there to be a Dark Lord for exactly that reason. Draco had asked Harry to stop and let him to think about this for a while before they continued. It had explained a lot about why Father and his friends had agreed to serve under a Dark Lord who often wasn't nice to them. In fact, Harry had said, this was pretty much the reason why people had governments. You might be better off if you stole from someone else, just like each prisoner would be individually better off if they defected in the prisoner's dilemma. But if everyone thought like that, the country would fall into chaos and everyone would be worse off, like what would happen if both prisoners defected. So people let themselves be ruled by governments, just like the Death Eaters had let themselves be ruled by the Dark Lord. Draco had asked Harry to stop again. Draco had always taken for granted that ambitious wizards put themselves in power because they wanted to rule, and people let themselves be ruled because they were scared little Hufflepuffs. And this, on reflection, still seemed true, but Harry's perspective was fascinating even if it was wrong. But, Harry had continued afterward, the fear of a third party punishing you was not the only possible reason to cooperate in the prisoner's dilemma. Suppose, Harry had said, you were playing the game against a magically produced identical copy of yourself. Draco had said that if there were 2 Dracos, of course neither Draco would want anything bad to happen to the other one, not to mention that no Malfoy would let himself become known as a traitor. Harry had nodded again, and said that this was yet another solution to the prisoner's dilemma. People might cooperate because they cared about each other, or because they had senses of honor, or because they wanted to preserve their reputation. Indeed, Harry had said, it was rather difficult to construct a true prisoner's dilemma. In real life, people usually cared about the other person, or their honor or their reputation or a Dark Lord's punishment or something besides the prison sentences. But suppose the copy had been of someone completely selfish. Pansy Parkinson had been the example they'd used. So each pansy only cared what happened to her and not to the other pansy. Given that this was all Pansy cared about, and that there was no Dark Lord, and Pansy wasn't worried about her reputation, and Pansy either had no sense of honor or didn't consider herself obligated to the other prisoner, then would the rational thing be for Pansy to cooperate, or defect? Some people, Harry said, claimed that the rational thing to do was for Pansy to defect against her copy, but Harry, plus someone named Douglas Hofstadter, thought these people were wrong. Because, Harry had said, if Pansy defected, not at random, but for what seemed to her like rational reasons, then the other Pansy would think exactly the same way. Two identical copies wouldn't decide different things. So Pansy had to choose between a world in which both pansies cooperated, or a world in which both pansies defected, and she was better off if both copies cooperated. And if Harry had thought rational people did defect in the prisoner's dilemma, then he wouldn't have done anything to spread that kind of rationality, because a country or a conspiracy full of rational people would dissolve into chaos. You would tell your enemies about rationality. Which had all sounded reasonable at the time, but now the thought was occurring to Draco that you said, Draco said, that the rational solution to the prisoner's dilemma is to cooperate. But of course you would want me to believe that, wouldn't you? And if Draco was fooled into cooperating, Harry would just say, haha, betrayed you again. And laugh at him about it afterward. I wouldn't fake your lessons, Harry said seriously. But I have to remind you, Draco, that I didn't say you should just automatically cooperate. Not on a true prisoner's dilemma like this one. What I said was that when you choose, you shouldn't think like you're choosing for just yourself, or like you're choosing for everyone. You should think like you're choosing for all the people who are similar enough to you that they'll probably do the same thing you do for the same reasons. And also choosing the predictions made by anyone who knows you well enough to predict you accurately, so that you never have to regret being rational because of the correct predictions that other people make about you. Remind me to explain about Newcomb's problem at some point. So the question you and I have to ask, Draco, is this: are we similar enough that we'll probably do the same thing whatever it is, making our decisions in mostly the same way? Or do we know each other well enough to predict each other, so that I can predict whether you'll cooperate or defect, and you can predict that I've decided to do the same thing I predict you'll do, because I know that you can predict me deciding that? And Draco could not help but think that since he had to strain just to understand half of that, the answer was obviously, no. Yes, said Draco. There was a pause. I see, said Harry, sounding disappointed. Oh, well, I guess we'll have to think of some other way, then. Draco hadn't thought that was going to work. Draco and Harry talked about it back and forth. They had both agreed much earlier that what they did on the battlefield would not count as broken promises in real life, though Draco was a little angry about what Harry had done in Professor Quirrell's office, and said so. But if the two of them couldn't rely on honor or friendship, that did leave the question of how to get their armies to work together on beating Sunshine, despite everything Granger might try to break them up. Professor Quirrell's rules didn't make it tempting to let Sunshine kill the other army's soldiers, that just increased the bar you had to pass yourself, but it did tempt each side to steal kills instead of acting like a single army would, or to shoot some of the other side's soldiers during the confusion of battle. Hermione was walking back to Ravenclaw, not really looking where she was going, her mind preoccupied with war and treachery and other age-inappropriate concepts, and she turned a corner and bumped straight into a grown-up. Sorry, she said automatically, and then, entirely without thinking, eek. Don't worry, Miss Granger, said the cheerful smile, set beneath the twinkling eyes, and above the silver beard, of the headmaster of Hogwarts. You are quite forgiven. Her gaze was helplessly locked on the kindly face of the most powerful wizard in the world, who was also the chief warlock, who was also the supreme mugwump, who had gone insane years ago from the stress of fighting the Dark Lord, and numerous other facts that were popping up into her mind one after the other while her throat went on making little embarrassing squeaks. In fact, Miss Granger, said Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, it is quite lucky that we bumped into each other. Why, I was just now wondering curiously what the three of you were thinking of asking for your wishes. Saturday dawned bright and clear, and with the students speaking in hushed voices, as though the first to shout might set off the explosion. Draco had hoped that they would be fighting in the upper levels of Hogwarts again. Professor Quirrell had said that real fights were more likely to take place in cities than forests, and fighting inside schoolrooms and corridors was supposed to simulate that, with ribbons to mark the allowed areas. Dragon Army had done well in those fights. Instead, just as Draco had feared, Professor Quirrell had come up with something special for this battle. The battleground was the Hogwarts Lake. And not in boats, either. They were fighting underwater. The giant squid had been temporarily paralyzed, spells had been set in place to keep away the Grindylows, Professor Quirrell had gone and talked to the merfolk, and all the soldiers had been issued potions of underwater action that allowed them to breathe, see clearly, talk to each other, and swim not quite as fast as a fast walk by kicking their legs. A huge silver sphere hung in the center of the battleground, shining like a small underwater moon. It would help to provide a sense of direction, at first. The moon would slowly go into eclipse as the battle went on, and when it had gone entirely dark, the battle would end if it hadn't already. War in water. You couldn't defend a perimeter, attackers could come at you from any direction, and even with the potion you couldn't see very far in the darkness of the lake. And if you swam too far away from the action, you would start to glow after a while, and be easy to hunt down. Ordinarily, if an army scattered and ran instead of fighting, Professor Quirrell would just declare them defeated, but today they were working on a point system. Of course you still had some time before you started to glow, if you wanted to play assassin. Dragon army had been set low in the water at the start of the game. Above and far away, the distant underwater moon shone. The murky water was mostly lit by Lumos charms, though his soldiers would extinguish the lights as soon as they began maneuvers. There was no point in letting the enemy see you before you saw them. Draco kicked his legs a few times, propelling him to a higher position from which he could gaze down at where his soldiers hovered in the water. The conversations died down almost at once under Draco's icy glare, his soldiers looking up at him with gratifying expressions of fear and worry. "Listen to me very carefully," said General Malfoy. His voice came out a little lower, a little burbly with bubbles, "Libston to me very carefully," but the sound traveled clearly. "There's only one way we can win this. We've got to march on Sunshine together with Chaos, and beat Sunshine. Then we fight it out with Potter and win. That's got to happen, understand? No matter what else goes on, that part has to happen that way." And Draco explained the plan he and Harry had come up with. Astonished looks were exchanged among the soldiers. "And if any of your plots get in the way of that," finished Draco, "after we are out of the water, I will set you on fire." There was a nervous chorus of yes-ears. "And everyone with secret orders, make sure you carry them out to the letter," said Draco. Around half his soldiers openly nodded, and Draco marked them for death after he rose to power. Of course all the private orders were fake, like one dragon being told to offer a false traitor's commission to another dragon, and the second dragon being told in hushed confidence to report anything said by the first dragon. Draco had told each dragon that the whole war could depend on that one thing, and that he hoped they understood it was more important than the plans they'd previously made. With luck that would keep all the idiots happy, and maybe flush out a few spies to boot, if the reports didn't match the instructions. Draco's real plan for winning against Chaos. Well, it was simpler than the one he'd burned, but Father still wouldn't have liked it. Despite trying, though, Draco hadn't been able to think of anything better. It was a plot that couldn't possibly have worked against anyone except Harry Potter. In fact, it had been Harry's plan originally, according to the traitor, though Draco had guessed that without being told. Draco and the traitor had just modified it a little. Harry took a deep breath, feeling the water gurgle harmlessly in his lungs. They'd fought in the forest, and he hadn't gotten a chance to say it. They'd fought in the corridors of Hogwarts, and he hadn't gotten a chance to say it. They'd fought in the air, broomsticks issued to every soldier, and it still hadn't made sense to say it. Harry had thought he wouldn't ever get to say those words, not while he was still young enough for them to be real. The Chaos Legionnaires were looking at Harry in puzzlement, as their general swam with his feet pointing up toward the distant light of the surface, and his head pointed down toward the murky depths. "Why are you upside down?" The young commander shouted at his army, and began to explain how to fight after you abandoned the privileged orientation of gravity. A hollow, booming bell echoed through the water, and on the instant, Zabini and Anthony and 5 other soldiers struck out downward, into the murky depths of the lake. Parvati Patil, the only Gryffindor in the group, turned her head back for a moment and gave them all a cheery wave as she dived, and after a moment, Scott and Matt did the same. The rest just sank and vanished. General Granger swallowed a lump in her throat as she watched them go. She was risking everything on this, dividing her army instead of just trying to take as many enemy soldiers with them as possible. The thing to realize, Zabini had told her, was that no army would move until they had a plan that let them expect victory. Sunshine couldn't just plan to win themselves, they had to make both other armies think they would win until it was too late. Ernie and Ron still looked like they were in shock. Susan was gazing after the disappearing soldiers with a calculating look. Her army, what was left of it, just looked bewildered, traceries of light dappling on their uniforms as they all drifted just below the sunlit surface of the lake. "Now what?" said Ron. "Now we wait," said Hermione, loudly enough for all the soldiers to hear. It felt odd to talk with her mouth full of water, she kept feeling like she was committing some sort of horrible impoliteness at the dinner table and was about to drool all over herself. "All of us left here are going to get zapped, but that was going to happen anyway with Dragon and Chaos ganging up on us. We've just got to take as many of them with us as we can." "I've got a plan," said one of her Sunshine soldiers. Hannah, her voice had been a little hard to recognize at first. It's like all complicated, but I know how we can get Dragon and Chaos to start fighting each other. Me too, said Faye. I've got a plan too. See, Neville Longbottom is secretly on our side. You were talking to Neville, said Ernie. That's not right, I was the one who. Daphne Greengrass and a couple of other Slytherins who hadn't gone with Zabini were giggling helplessly as the cries of "No, wait, I was the one who got Longbottom" erupted from one soldier after another. Hermione just looked at them all wearily. Okay, said Hermione when it had all died down, does everyone get it? All your plots were faked by the Chaos Legion, or maybe some by Dragon. Anyone who really wanted to betray Harry or Malfoy went straight to me or Zabini, not you. Just go ahead and compare notes on all your secret plots and you'll see it for yourselves. She might not be as good at plotting as Zabini, but she could always understand what all her officers told her. That was why Professor Quirrell had made her the general. So don't bother trying to do any plots when the other armies get here. Just fight, okay, please. But, said Ernie with shock on his face, Neville is in Hufflepuff. You're saying he lied to us? Daphne was laughing so hard and so helplessly that the exhalations had turned her upside down in the water. I'm not sure what Longbottom is, said Ron darkly, but I don't think he's a Hufflepuff anymore. Not now that Harry Potter's got to him. Do you know, said Susan, I asked him that, and Neville told me he had become a Chaos Hufflepuff. Anyway, said Hermione in a loud voice. Zabini took with everyone who we thought was a spy, so in our army we can stop watching each other quite so hard now, I hope. Anthony was a spy, yelled Ron. Parvati was a spy, gasped Hannah. Parvati was totally a spy, said Daphne. She shopped at the spy shoe store and wore spy lipstick, and someday she's going to marry a nice spy husband and have a lot of little spies. And then a gong sound echoed through the water, indicating that Sunshine had just scored 2 points. This was shortly followed by the triple gong of Dragon losing a single point. Traitors weren't allowed to kill generals, not after the disaster of the first battle in December when all 3 generals had been shot in the first minute. But with any luck. Ah, said Hermione. It sounds like Mr. Crabbe is taking a little nap. Like 2 shoals of fish, the armies swam along. Neville Longbottom kicked his feet in slow, measured motions. Diving, always diving in whatever direction you happen to be moving. You wanted to show the enemy the smallest profile, present them with your head or your feet. So you were always diving, downward and head first, and the enemy was always down. Like every Chaos Legionnaire in the army, Neville's head was constantly rotating as he swam, looking up, down, around, to every side. Not just watching for Sunshine soldiers, but watching for any sign that a Chaos Legionnaire had drawn their wand and was about to betray them. Usually traitors waited until the confusion of battle to make their move, but that early gong had put them all on guard. The truth was, Neville was feeling sad about that. In November he'd been a soldier in a united army, all of them pulling together and helping each other, and now they were all watching each other constantly for the first signs of betrayal. It might have been more fun for General Chaos, but it wasn't nearly as much fun for Neville. The direction formerly known as up was getting steadily brighter, as they came closer to the surface and sunshine. Wands out, said General Chaos. Neville's squad drew their wands, pointing them straight ahead toward the enemy, as their heads scanned around more rapidly. If there were sunny traitors, the time was approaching for them to strike. The other shoal of fish, Dragon Army, was doing the same thing. Now, shouted the distant voice of the Dragon General. Now, shouted General Chaos. For Sunshine, shouted all the soldiers in both armies, and charged downward. What? Said Minerva involuntarily as she watched the screens from next to the lake. A cry echoed in many other places. All of Hogwarts was watching this battle as they had watched the first. Professor Quirrell was laughing dryly. I warned you, Headmaster. It is impossible to have rules without Mr. Potter exploiting them. For long precious seconds, as the 47 soldiers charged her own 17, Hermione's mind went blank. Why? Then it all snapped into place. Every time a soldier originally from Sunshine got shot by someone crying the name of Sunshine, she would lose a Quirrell point. When 2 Sunshine soldiers were shot by either army, both enemy armies would be 2 points closer to overtaking her. It was the same gain, only shared. And if anyone shot another soldier not in the name of Sunshine, that gong wouldn't get lost in the confusion. Hermione was suddenly very glad that Zabini hadn't gone with the obvious plan of starting trouble between the other 2 armies while they attacked Sunshine. It was still disheartening, though, that sense of your chances closing down, of hope being taken away. Most of Hermione's soldiers were still looking confused, but some had expressions of dawning horror as they got it. It's all right, Susan Bones said firmly. Heads turned to look at the Sunshine Captain. Our job is the same, to take as many of them with us as we can. And remember, Zabini took away all the spies. We don't have to stay on the lookout like they do. The girl was smiling defiantly, provoking answering smiles from many of the other soldiers, even from Hermione herself. It can be like it was in November. We just have to keep our heads high, fight our best, and trust each other. Daphne shot her. Blood for the blood god, shrieked Neville of Chaos, though since he was underwater it came out more like blubbled for the blubbled glub. Captain Weasley spun and raised his wand toward Neville and fired. But Neville was swimming downward toward him, wand pointed straight ahead, and that meant the simple shield could shelter Neville's entire profile. If anyone shot him now, it wasn't going to be Sunny Ron. A grimly determined look came over Captain Weasley's face, and he arrowed straight up toward Neville, mouthing the word Contigo, though the shield wasn't visible in the water. The two enemy champions shot toward each other like arrows released from bows, each aimed to split the other down the middle. They had dueled many times before, but this time would pay for all. Far away by the lakeside, 100 breaths were held. Rainbows and unicorns, roared the Sunshine Captain. The black goat with 1,000 young. Do your homework. Closer and yet closer, the two champions charged, neither willing to swerve. The first person to turn would present a vulnerable broadside and get shot, though if neither lost their nerve they would crash right into each other. Falling straight down as the enemy rose straight up to meet him, hammer descending to meet anvil in a path neither was willing to leave. Special attack, chaotic twist. Neville saw the look of horror on Captain Weasley's face as the hover charm caught him. They'd tested it before the battle had started, and just as Harry had suspected, Wingardium Leviosa became a whole new sort of weapon once everyone was swimming underwater. Curse you, Longbottom, shrieked Ron Weasley, can't you ever fight without your dumb special attacks? And by that time the Sunshine Captain had been spun around sideways and Neville shot him in the leg. I don't fight fair, said Neville to the sleeping form, I fight like Harry Potter. Granger, 237, Malfoy, 217, Potter, 220. It still hurt every time he had to shoot Hermione. Harry could hardly stand to look at the expression of peace that had come over her sleeping face, arms now drifting aimlessly as the curves of sunlight moved over her camouflage uniform and the cloud of her chestnut hair. And if Harry had tried to duck out of being the one to shoot her, not only would Draco have known what it meant, Hermione would have been offended. She's not dead, Harry said to his brain as his kicking feet pushed him away, she's just resting. Idiot. Are you sure? Said his brain. What if she's an ex-Hermione? Could we go back and check? Harry glanced back briefly. See, she's fine, there are bubbles coming out of her mouth. Could have been her last breath escaping. Oh, be quiet. Why are you being so paranoid protective, anyway? First real friend we've ever had in our whole life. Hey, remember what happened to our pet rock? Would you shut up about that worthless lump of rubble? It wasn't even alive, let alone sentient. That is like the most pathetic childhood trauma ever. The two armies swiftly separated, becoming two shoals of fish once more. General Granger had gone down 17 points, and taken 3 chaotics and 2 dragons with her, and 1 chaotic and 2 dragons had been shot as traitors. So she'd lost net 7 points, Harry had lost 1, Draco had lost 2, that put Sunshine 20 points up on Dragon, and 17 points up on Chaos. Chaos could still win easily if they exterminated all 20 remaining dragons. The wild card, of course, being those 7 remaining Sunshine soldiers. If you could call them that. The two shoals swam uneasily next to each other, the soldiers in each army awaiting an order to call out their true allegiances, and attack. Everyone who got them, Harry said loudly, remember special orders 1 through 3. And don't forget it's Merlin says on 3. Do not acknowledge. The trustworthy 2/3 of the army did not nod, and the other third just looked puzzled. Special Order 1, don't bother trying to call out any code words in this battle, don't expend effort on any plot not specially approved by the commander, just swim, shield, and fire. Hermione and Draco had both been fighting their soldiers, trying to get them to stop plotting on their own all through December. Harry had egged his soldiers on and supported their plotting through the last 2 battles. While also telling them that at some future point he might ask them to put a plot or 2 on hold, to which they'd all readily agreed. So now, in this critical battle, they were happy to obey. Neither Hermione or Draco could have given that order successfully, Harry was certain. It was the difference between your soldiers seeing you as an ally in their plotting, and seeing you as a spoilsport old fuddy-duddy who didn't want them to have any fun. Imposition of order equaled escalation of chaos, and it also worked in reverse. There they are, shouted someone, and pointed. From the depths of the lake arose the forgotten ones, the ones who'd forsaken the last battle, the 7 missing Sunshine soldiers glowing with the bright aura of cowards, now fading as they returned to battle. The 2 shoals of fish wavered, pointing wands uneasily. Hold your fire, shouted Harry, and a similar cry came from General Malfoy. There was a moment of held breath. Then the 7 Sunshine soldiers swam up to join Dragon Army. There was a triumphant cheer from Dragon Army. There were cries of dismay from a third of the Chaos Legion. Some of the other 2/3 smiled, though they shouldn't have. Harry wasn't smiling. Oh, this is so completely not going to work. But Harry hadn't been able to think of anything better. Special Orders 2 and 3 still apply, shouted Harry. Fight! For the Chaos Legion, roared 20 Chaotic Legionnaires. For Dragon Army, roared 20 Dragon Warriors and 7 Sunshine Soldiers. And the Chaotix dived straight downward, as all the traitors got ready to strike. Granger, 237, Malfoy, 220, Potter, 226. Draco's head darted around frantically, trying to weigh up what was happening. Somehow, despite his greater forces, he'd lost the initiative. 4 small chaotic forces were being pursued by 4 larger dragon forces, but because Draco's forces were the ones trying to force an engagement, it meant that they had to follow where chaos ran, and somehow that was producing concentrations of chaotic force that would fire into the exposed sides of Dragon. It was happening again. Prismatus! Shouted Draco, raising his wand, and that shield you could see even through the water, a sparkling multicolored flat wall wide enough to shield Draco and the 5 other dragons with him from the chaotic force that had just started firing on them as they swam past, and that let the other 5 dragons turn their attentions back to the chaotic force they'd been chasing. There was a tense moment as sleep spell after sleep spell crashed into Draco's prismatic wall, and Draco was hoping to Merlin that none of those 4 chaotics had learned the breaking drill hex. Then there was the bell of a dragon victory, and the chaotic force spun head for foot and began swimming away, and Draco, his hands now shaking slightly, dropped the prismatic wall and lowered his wand. Fighting in water was more exhausting even than fighting on broomsticks. Do not pursue, Draco cried to his soldiers as they started to follow, then, sonorous. Reform on me. The dragon forces started converging on Draco, and the chaotic forces spun around and began pursuing the dragons on the instant. Draco swore out loud as he heard the bell of a chaotic victory. Someone hadn't gotten their simple shield oriented right, and then the dragon forces were in supporting range of each other and the chaotics were moving back into the murky distance. Somehow, despite their numerical superiority, the dragons had scored 3 times against the chaotics and the chaotics had scored 4 times back, and he'd heard one dragon spy get executed. Either Harry Potter had thought of a lot of very good ideas very fast, or for some unimaginable reason he'd already spent a lot of time working out how to fight underwater. This wasn't working, and Draco needed to rethink things. It looked like everyone was having trouble aiming while swimming, too. The battle might last long enough that time would be called. The distant underwater moon was only half full now, that wasn't good. He had to rethink things fast. What is it? Said Padma Patil, as she and her force swam over toward Draco. Padma was his second in command, she was clever and powerful, and better yet, she hated Granger and saw Harry as a rival, which made her trustworthy. Working with Padma was making him realize the truth of the old adage that Ravenclaw was sister to Slytherin. Draco had been surprised when his father had told him it was an acceptable house for his future wife, but now he saw the sense of it. Wait until we're all here, Draco said. The truth was, he needed to catch his breath. That was the trouble with being the general and the most powerful wizard, you had to keep using magic. Zabini came in next, commanding a force of 2 Sunnies and 4 dragons, one of whom was Gregory keeping an eye on Zabini. Draco didn't trust Zabini. And neither Draco nor Zabini trusted the Sunnies enough to make them a majority of any unit. They were supposed to be loyal either to Draco directly, or to Granger, who'd been fooled by the promise that the dragons would be betrayed in the end after both forces had been depleted, just as Harry's more trusted chaotics should have been fooled into not shooting at the Sunnies by the promise of their firing fake sleep hexes and switching to support chaos later, but it was possible some of the Sunnies were loyal to chaos and weren't firing real sleep hexes, and that was why Dragon wasn't winning the way their numerical advantage should have let them win. The next unit that approached was depleted, 3 soldiers holding wands on 2 other soldiers, who were swimming with empty hands. Draco gritted his teeth. More traitor problems. He needed to talk to Professor Quirrell about having some way to punish traitors at least. Conditions like these were unrealistic. In real life you tortured your traitors to death. General Malfoy, shouted the commander of the problem unit as it swam up, a Ravenclaw boy named Terry. We don't know what to do. Ceci shot Bogdan, but Ceci says Kella told him that Bogdan shot Spectre. I didn't, said Kella. Yes you did, shrieked Ceci. General Malfoy, she's the spy, I should have Somnium, said Draco. There was the triple bell of a 1-point loss from Dragon, and then Kella's limp body began to float away in the water. Draco had heard the word, recursion, by this point, and he knew a Harry Potter plot when he saw one. Unfortunately Draco had not heard of autoimmune disorders, and the thought did not readily occur to him that a clever virus would begin its attack by creating symptoms of an autoimmune disorder so as to get the body to distrust its own immune system. General order, said Draco, raising his voice. Nobody gets to shoot spies except myself, Gregory, Padma, and Terry. If anyone sees anything suspicious they come to one of us. And then. There was the bell of Sunshine scoring 2 points. What? Said Draco and Zabini around the same time, their heads swiveled around. No one seemed to have gotten hit, and all the Sunshine soldiers were present and accounted for. Except Parvati, who had been shot by some still unknown traitor in Padma's squad, and of course Padma had shot Parvati again in case she was faking, so it wasn't her. A sunny traitor in chaos, said Zabini, sounding puzzled. But all the ones I knew about were supposed to strike during Chaos's attack on Sunshine. No, said Padma in a tone of sudden realization. That was Chaos executing a spy. What? Said Zabini. But why? And Draco got it. Damn it. Because Potter thinks he's safe for how much he beats Sunshine, but not for how much he beats us. So he doesn't want to lose a single point when he executes a traitor. General order. If you have to execute a traitor, call Sunshine first. And don't forget to switch back to Dragon afterward. Granger, 253, Malfoy, 252, Potter, 252. Longbottom's body drifted chaotically through the water, arms and legs disarrayed. After Draco had finally got a hit in, they'd all shot him again just to be sure. Nearby was Harry Potter, now protected by a prismatic sphere, looking at them all grimly as the last sliver of crescent moon slowly diminished, somewhere far away. If Longbottom had managed to shoot one more soldier, Draco knew Harry was thinking, if the two Chaotix had managed to hold out just a little longer, they might have won. After Draco had reformed his forces and struck out again, the ensuing battle and execution of spies in Sunshine's name had left Sunshine exactly 1 point ahead of Dragon and Chaos both. Once Harry had started doing it, Draco had been left with no choice but to follow suit. But now they had General Chaos outnumbered 3-1, the survivors of Dragon Army and the last remaining Sunny traitor, Draco, and Padma, and Zabini. And Draco, who was no fool, had ordered Padma to take Zabini's wand after Longbottom had shot Gregory and fallen in turn to Draco. The boy had given him an insulted look, told Draco that he owed him for this, and handed it over. That left Draco and Padma to take down General Chaos. I don't suppose you'd like to surrender, said Draco, smiling as evilly as any smile he'd ever directed at Harry Potter. Sleep before surrender, shouted General Chaos. Just so you know, said Draco, Zabini doesn't actually have an older sister for you to rescue from Gryffindor bullies. But Zabini does have a mother who doesn't approve of Muggleborns like Granger, and I wrote her a few notes, and offered Zabini a few favors, nothing involving my father, just things I can do in school. And by the way, Zabini's mother doesn't approve of the boy who lived, either. Just in case you still thought Zabini was really on your side. Harry's face grew even grimmer. Draco raised his wand, and began breathing rhythmically, building up strength for a breaking drill hex. Granger's prismatic sphere was almost as strong as Draco's now, and Harry's wasn't much weaker. Where did those two find time? Login, spoke Draco, putting everything he had into it, and the green spiral blazed out and Harry's shield shattered, and at almost the same moment. Somnium, said Padma. Granger, 253, Malfoy, 252, Potter, 254. Harry let out a long breath of relief, and not just because he didn't have to hold the prismatic sphere anymore. His hand was shaking as he lowered his wand. You know, said Harry, I was pretty worried there for a moment. Special Order 2, if a Sunny traitor doesn't seem to be really shooting at you, fake being hit occasionally. Prefer targeting dragons to Sunnies, but go ahead and shoot Sunnies if you can't shoot dragons. Special Order 3, Merlin says do not shoot at Blaze Zabini or either Pottle twin. With a wide grin, Parvati Pottle stripped the transfigured patch off her uniform's insignia, and let it float away in the water. Gryffindors for chaos, she said, and handed Zabini his wand back. Thank you very much, Harry said, and bowed sweepingly to the Gryffindor girl. And thank you as well, bowing to Zabini. You know, when you came to me with that plan, I wondered if you were brilliant or crazy, and I've decided that you're both. And by the way, Harry said, now turning as though to address Draco's body, Zabini does have a cousin. Somnium, said Zabini's voice. Granger, 255, Malfoy, 252, Potter, 254. And Harry Potter's body floated away, his expression of shock and horror quickly relaxing into sleep. On second thought, Parvati said cheerfully, make that Gryffindors for Sunshine. She started to laugh, more exhilarated than she'd ever been in her life. She'd finally gotten to assassinate and replace her twin sister, and she'd wanted to do that since forever, and this had been perfect. It had all been perfect. And then her wand spun around in a lightning motion just as Zabini's wand turned to point at her. Wait, said Zabini. Do not shoot, do not resist. That's an order. What? Said Parvati. Sorry, said Zabini, looking not quite sincerely apologetic, but I can't be totally sure you're for Sunshine. So I order you to let me shoot you. Hold on, said Parvati. We're only ahead of Chaos by 1 point. If you shoot me now, I'll shoot you in the name of Dragon, obviously, said Zabini, now sounding a little superior. Just because we tricked them into doing it doesn't mean it won't work for us. Parvati stared at him, her eyes narrowing. General Malfoy said your mother doesn't like Hermione. I suppose, said Zabini, still with that superior smirk. But some of us are more willing than Draco Malfoy to annoy a parent. And Harry Potter said you have a cousin. Nope, said Zabini. Parvati stared at him, trying to think, but she wasn't really good at plotting. Zabinid said the plan was to secretly keep the scores of Chaos and Dragon as even as possible so they'd use Sunshine's name to execute their traitors instead of losing even a single point, and that had worked. But she had the feeling she was missing something. She wasn't a Slytherin. Why don't I shoot you in the name of Dragon? Said Parvati. Because I outrank you, said Zabini. Parvati had a bad feeling about this. She stared at him for a long moment. And then, Somni, she started to say, and then realized she hadn't said for Dragon, and frantically cut herself off. Granger, 255, Malfoy, 254, Potter, 254. Hey, everyone, said Blaise Zabini's face on the screens, looking quite amused. Guess it's all down to me. All by the lakeside, people were holding their breath. Sunshine was ahead of Dragon and Chaos by exactly 1 point. Blaise Zabini could shoot himself in the name of either Dragon or Chaos, or just leave things the way they were. A series of chimes indicated that the last minute of time was running out. And the Slytherin was smiling a strange, twisted smile, and casually toying with his wand, the dark wood barely visible in the dark water. You know, said Blaise Zabini's voice, in the tones of someone who'd been rehearsing the words for a while, it's just a game, really. And games are supposed to be fun. So how about if I just do whatever I feel like? 34. Coordination problems, PT2. Minerva and Dumbledore together had applied their combined talent to conjure the grand stage toward which Quirrell now slowly trudged. It was, at its core, sturdy wood, but the outer surfaces shone with glitter of marble inlaid with platinum and studded with gems of every house color. Neither she nor the headmaster was any founder of Hogwarts, but the conjuration only needed to last a few hours. Minerva ordinarily enjoyed the few occasions when she had the occasion to tire herself out on large transfigurations. She should have enjoyed the many small chances for artistry, and the illusion of opulence, but this time she had done the work with the dreadful feeling of digging her own grave. But Minerva was feeling a little better now. There'd been one brief moment when the explosion might have come, but Dumbledore had already been standing up and applauding warmly, and no one had proven foolish enough to riot in front of the headmaster. And the explosive mood had rapidly faded into a collective sentiment which might perhaps have been described by the phrase, give us a break. Blaise Zabini had shot himself in the name of Sunshine, and the final score had been 254 to 254 to 254. Behind the stage, waiting to ascend, 3 children were glaring at each other in mingled fury and frustration. It didn't help that they were still damp from being fished out of the lake, and that the warming charms didn't seem quite enough to make up for the crisp December air, or maybe it was just their mood. That's it, said Granger. I've had it. No more traitors. I completely agree with you, Miss Granger, Draco said icily. Enough is enough. And what do you two intend to do about it? Snapped Harry Potter. Professor Quirrell already said he wouldn't ban spies. We'll ban them for him, said Draco grimly. He hadn't even understood what he meant by the words as he said them, but the very act of speaking seemed to crystallize a plan. The stage really was well done, at least for a temporary structure. The makers hadn't fallen into the usual pitfall of being impressed by their own illusion of wealth, and knew something about architecture and visual style. From where Draco stood, in the obvious place for him to stand, the watching students would see him haloed in the faint glitter of emeralds, and Granger, standing where Draco had subtly motioned her, would be haloed in Ravenclaw's sapphire. As for Harry Potter, Draco wasn't looking at him right now. Professor Quirrell had awakened, or whatever it was he did, and was leaning upon a platinum podium bare of all gems. With evident showmanship, the defense professor was carefully stacking and squaring those 3 envelopes containing the 3 parchments upon which the 3 generals had written their wishes, as all the students of Hogwarts watched, and waited. Finally Professor Quirrell looked up from the envelopes. Well, said the defense professor. This is inconvenient. A slight titter of laughter ran through the crowd, with a sharp undertone. I suppose you are all wondering what I will do, said Professor Quirrell. There is nothing for it, I shall have to do what is fair. Although first there was a little speech I wanted to make, and before even that, it appears to me that Mr. Malfoy and Miss Granger have something they wish to share. Draco blinked, and then he and Granger traded rapid glances. May I? Yes, go ahead, and Draco raised his voice. General Granger and I would both like to say, Draco said in his most formal voice, knowing it was being amplified and heard, that we will no longer accept the help of any traitors. And if, in any battle, we find that Potter has accepted traitors from either of our armies, we will join forces to crush him. And Draco shot a glance filled at malice at the boy who lived. Take that, General Chaos. I agree completely with General Malfoy, said Granger standing beside him, her high voice clear and strong. Neither of us will use traitors, and if General Potter does, we will wipe him off the battlefield. There was a susurration of surprise from the watching students. Very good, said their defense professor, smiling. It took the 2 of you long enough, but you are still to be congratulated on having thought of it before any other generals. It took a moment for this to soak in. In the future, Mr. Malfoy, Miss Granger, before you come to my office with any request, consider whether there is a way for you to accomplish it without my help. I will not deduct Quirrell points on this occasion, but next time you may expect to lose the full 50. Professor Quirrell wore an amused grin. And what do you have to say about that, Mr. Potter? Harry Potter's gaze went to Granger, then to Draco. His face appeared calm, though Draco was sure controlled would have been the better term. Finally Harry Potter spoke, his voice level. The Chaos Legion is still happy to accept traitors. See you on the battlefield. Draco knew the shock was showing on his own face. There were astonished murmurs from the watching students, and when Draco glanced at the front row he saw that even Harry's chaotix looked taken aback. Granger's face was angry, and getting angrier. Mr. Potter, she said in a sharp tone like she thought she was a teacher, are you trying to be obnoxious? Most certainly not, Harry Potter said calmly. I won't make you do it every time. Beat me once, and I'll stay beaten. But threats aren't always enough, General of Sunshine. You did not ask me to join with you, but tried simply to impose your will, and sometimes you must actually defeat the enemy, to impose your will on him. You see, I am skeptical that Hermione Granger, the brightest academic star of Hogwarts, and Draco, son of Lucius, scion of the noble and most ancient house of Malfoy, can work together to beat their common foe, Harry Potter. An amused smile crossed Harry Potter's face. Maybe I'll just do what Draco tried with Zabini, and write a letter to Lucius Malfoy and see what he thinks about that. Harry, gasped Granger, looking absolutely aghast, and there were gasps from the audience as well. Draco controlled the anger flushing through him. That had been a stupid move on Harry's part, saying that in public. If Harry had simply done it, it might have worked. Draco hadn't even thought about that, but now if father did that it would look like he was playing into Harry's hands. If you think my father, Lord Malfoy, can be manipulated by you that easily, Draco said coldly, you have a surprise coming, Harry Potter. And Draco realized as the words finished leaving his mouth that he'd just backed his own father squarely into the corner, more or less without even meaning to. Father probably wasn't going to like this, not the tiniest bit, but now it would be impossible for him to say so. Draco would have to apologize for that. It had been an honest accident, but it was strange to think that he'd done it at all. Then go ahead and defeat the evil General Chaos, Harry said, still looking amused. I can't win against both your armies, not if you really work together. But I wonder if perhaps I could break you up before then. You won't, and we'll crush you, said Draco Malfoy. And beside him, Hermione Granger firmly nodded. Well, said Professor Quirrell after the astounded silence had stretched for a while. That was not how I expected that particular conversation to go. The defense professor had a rather intrigued expression on his face. Truthfully, Mr. Potter, I expected you to concede immediately and with a smile, then announce that you had long since worked out my intended lesson but had decided not to spoil it for others. Indeed, I planned my speech accordingly, Mr. Potter. Harry Potter just shrugged. Sorry about that, he said, and said nothing more. Oh, don't worry, said Professor Quirrell. This, too, will serve. And Professor Quirrell turned from the three children, and straightened at the podium to address the whole watching crowd. His customary air of detached amusement dropped away like a falling mask, and when he spoke again his voice was amplified louder than it had been. If not for Harry Potter, said Professor Quirrell, his voice as crisp and cold as December, you know who would have won. The silence was instant, and total. Make no mistake, said Professor Quirrell. The Dark Lord was winning. There were fewer and fewer Aurors who dared face him, the vigilantes who opposed him were being hunted down. One Dark Lord and perhaps 50 Death Eaters were winning against a country of thousands. That is beyond ridiculous. There are no grades low enough for me to mark that incompetence. There was a frown on the face of Headmaster Dumbledore, and on the faces of the audience, puzzlement, and the utter silence went on. Do you understand now how it happened? You saw it today. I allowed traitors, and gave the generals no means to restrain them. You saw the result. Clever plots and clever betrayals, until the last soldier left on the battlefield shot himself. You cannot possibly doubt that all three of those armies could have been defeated by any outside foe that was unified within itself. Professor Quirrell leaned forward at the podium, his voice now filled with a grim intensity. His right hand stretched out, fingers open and spread. Division is weakness, said the defense professor. His hand closed into a tight fist. Unity is strength. The Dark Lord understood that well, whatever his other follies, and he used that understanding to create the one simple invention that made him the most terrible Dark Lord in history. Your parents faced one Dark Lord. And 50 Death Eaters who were perfectly unified, knowing that any breach of their loyalty would be punished by death, that any slack or incompetence would be punished by pain. None could escape the Dark Lord's grasp once they took his mark. And the Death Eaters agreed to take that terrible mark because they knew that once they took it they would be united, facing a divided land. One Dark Lord and 50 Death Eaters would have defeated an entire country, by the power of the Dark Mark. Professor Quirrell's voice was bleak and hard. Your parents could have fought back in kind. They did not. There was a man named Yermi Wibble who called upon the nation to institute a draft, though he did not quite have vision enough to propose a Mark of Britain. Yermi Wibble knew what would happen to him, he hoped his death would inspire others. So the Dark Lord took his family for good measure. Their empty skins inspired nothing but fear, and no one dared to speak again. And your parents would have faced the consequences of their despicable cowardice, if not for being saved by a 1-year-old boy. Professor Quirrell's face showed full contempt. A dramatist would have called that a deus ex machina, for they did nothing to earn their salvation. He who must not be named may not have deserved to win, but make no doubt of it, your parents deserved to lose. The voice of the defense professor rang forth like iron. And know this, your parents have learned nothing. The nation is still fragmented and weak. How few decades passed between Grindelwald and you know who. Do you think you will not see the next threat in your own lifetimes? Will you repeat then the follies of your parents, when you have seen the results so clearly laid out before you this day? For I can tell you what your parents will do, when the day of darkness comes. I can tell you what lesson they have learned. They have learned to hide like cowards and do nothing while they wait for Harry Potter to save them. There was a wondering look in the eyes of Headmaster Dumbledore, and other students gazed up at their defense professor with bewilderment and anger and awe. Professor Quirrell's eyes were as cold now as his voice. Mark this, and mark it well. He who must not be named wished to rule over this country, to hold it in his cruel grasp forever. But at least he wished to rule over a living country, and not a heap of ash. There have been Dark Lords who were mad, who wished only to make the world a vast funeral pyre. There have been wars in which one whole country marched against another. Your parents nearly lost against 100, who thought to take this country alive. How quickly would they have been crushed by a foe more numerous than they, a foe that cared for nothing but their destruction. This I foretell, when the next threat rises, Lucius Malfoy will claim that you must follow him or perish, that your only hope is to trust in his cruelty and strength. And though Lucius Malfoy himself will believe it, this will be a lie. For when the Dark Lord perished, Lucius Malfoy did not unite the Death Eaters, they were shattered in an instant, they fled like whipped dogs and betrayed each other. Lucius Malfoy is not strong enough to be a true lord, dark or otherwise. Draco Malfoy's fists were clenched white, there were tears in his eyes, and fury, and unbearable shame. No, said Professor Quirrell, I do not think it will be Lucius Malfoy who saves you. And lest you think that I speak on my own behalf, time will make clear soon enough that this is not so. I make you no recommendation, my students. But I say that if a whole country were to find a leader as strong as the Dark Lord, but honorable and pure, and take his mark, then they could crush any Dark Lord like an insect, and all the rest of our divided magical world could not threaten them. And if some still greater enemy rose against us in a war of extermination, then only a united magical world could survive. There were gasps, mostly from Muggleborns. The students in green-trimmed robes looked merely puzzled. Now it was Harry Potter whose fists were clenched tight and trembling, and Hermione Granger beside him was angry and dismayed. The headmaster rose from his seat, his face now stern, saying no word as yet, but the command was clear. I do not say what threat will come, said Professor Quirrell. But you will not live all your lives in peace, not if the past history of the world is any guide at all to its future. And if you do in the future as you have seen 3 armies do this day, if you cannot throw aside your petty bickering and take the mark of a single leader, then indeed you might wish that the Dark Lord had lived to rule over you, and regret the day that ever Harry Potter was born. Enough, bellowed Albus Dumbledore. There was silence. Professor Quirrell slowly turned his head to gaze at where Albus Dumbledore stood in the fury of his wizardry, their eyes met, and a soundless stress pressed down like weight upon all the students, as they listened not daring to move. You, too, failed this country, said Professor Quirrell. And you know the peril as well as I. Such speeches are not for the ears of students, said Albus Dumbledore in a dangerously rising voice. Nor for the mouths of professors. Dryly, then, Professor Quirrell spoke, there were many speeches made for the ears of adults, as the Dark Lord rose. And the adults clapped and cheered, and went home having enjoyed their day's entertainment. But I will obey you, headmaster, and make no further speeches if you do not like them. My lesson is simple. I will go on doing nothing about traitors, and we will see what students can do for themselves about that, when they do not wait for professors to save them. And then Professor Quirrell turned back to his students, and his mouth quirked up in a wry grin that seemed to dissipate the dreadful pressure like a god blowing to scatter the clouds. But do please be kind to the traitors up until now, said Professor Quirrell. They were just having fun. There was laughter, though it was nervous at first, and then it seemed to build, as Professor Quirrell stood there smiling wryly and some of the tension released itself. Draco's mind was still whirling through 1,000 questions and a daze of horror, as Professor Quirrell prepared to open the envelopes in which the 3 had inscribed their wishes. It had never before occurred to Draco that moon-traveling muggles were a greater threat than the slow decline of wizardry, or that Father had proven himself too weak to stop them. And even stranger, the obvious implication, Professor Quirrell believed that Harry could. The defense professor claimed to have made no recommendation, but he'd mentioned Harry Potter over and over in his speech. Others would already be thinking the same thing as Draco. It was ridiculous. The boy who had covered a stuffed chair in glitter and called it a throne. The boy who faced down Snape and won, whispered a traitorous voice, that boy could grow into a lord strong enough to rule, strong enough to save us all. Harry had been raised by muggles. He was practically a mudblood himself, he wouldn't fight against his adopted family. He knows their arts, their secrets and their methods, he can take all of the muggles' science and use it against them, alongside our own power as wizards. But what if he refuses? What if he's too weak? Then, said that inner voice, it will have to be you, won't it, Draco Malfoy? And then there was a renewed hush from the crowd, as Professor Quirrell opened the first envelope. Mr. Malfoy, said Professor Quirrell, your wish is for Slytherin to win the House Cup. There was a puzzled pause from the watching audience. Yes, Professor, said Draco in a clear voice, knowing that it was once again being amplified. If you can't do that, then something else for Slytherin. I will not award house points unfairly, said Professor Quirrell. He tapped a cheek, looking thoughtful. Which makes your wish difficult enough to be interesting. Would you like to say anything about why, Mr. Malfoy? Draco turned from the defense professor, gazed out at the crowd from against that backdrop of platinum and emeralds. Not all of Slytherin had cheered for Diagon Army, there were anti-Malfoy factions who had expressed that dissatisfaction by supporting the boy who lived, or even Granger, and those factions would be encouraged greatly by what Zabini had done. He needed to remind them that Slytherin meant Malfoy and Malfoy meant Slytherin. No, said Draco. They're Slytherins, they'll understand. There was some laughter from the audience, especially in Slytherin, even from some students who would have called themselves anti-Malfoy a moment earlier. Flattery was a lovely thing. Draco turned back to look at Professor Quirrell again, and was surprised to see an embarrassed look on Granger's face. And for Miss Granger, said Professor Quirrell, there was the sound of a tearing envelope. Your wish is for Ravenclaw to win the House Cup. There was considerable laughter from the audience, including a chuckle from Draco. He hadn't thought Granger played that game. Well, said Granger, sounding like she was suddenly stumbling over a memorized speech, I meant to say, that. She took a deep breath. There were soldiers from every house in my army, and I don't mean to slight any of them. But houses should still count for something, too. It was sad when students in the same house were hexing each other just because they were in different armies. People should be able to rely on whoever's in their house. That's why Godric Gryffindor, and Salazar Slytherin, and Rowena Ravenclaw, and Helga Hufflepuff created the 4 houses of Hogwarts in the first place. I'm the General of Sunshine, but even before that, I'm Hermione Granger of Ravenclaw, and I'm proud to be part of a house that's 800 years old. Well said, Miss Granger, said Dumbledore's booming voice. Harry Potter was frowning, and something tickled at the edge of Draco's recognition. An interesting sentiment, Miss Granger, said Professor Quirrell. But there are times when it is good for a Slytherin to have friends in Ravenclaw, or for a Gryffindor to have friends in Hufflepuff. Surely it would be best if you could rely both on your friends in your house, and also your friends in your army. Granger's eyes flicked briefly toward the watching students and teachers, and she said nothing. Professor Quirrell nodded as though to himself, and then turned back to the podium, and took up and tore open the last envelope. Beside Draco, Harry Potter visibly tensed up as the defense professor drew forth the parchment. And Mr. Potter wishes for. There was a pause as Professor Quirrell looked at the parchment. Then, without any change of expression on Professor Quirrell's face, the sheet of parchment burst into flames, and burned with a brief, intense fire that left only drifting black dust sprinkling down from his hand. Please confine yourself to the possible, Mr. Potter, said Professor Quirrell, sounding very dry indeed. There was a long pause. Harry, standing beside Draco, looked rather shaken. What in Merlin's name did he ask for? I do hope, said Professor Quirrell, that you prepared another wish, if I could not grant that one. There was another pause. Harry drew a deep breath. I didn't, he said, but I already thought of another one. Harry Potter turned to look out at the audience, and his voice firmed as he spoke. People fear traitors because of the damage the traitor does directly, the soldiers they shoot or the secrets they tell. But that's only part of the danger. What people do because they're afraid of traitors also costs them. I used that strategy today against Sunshine and Dragon. I didn't tell my traitors to cause as much direct damage as possible. I told them to act in the way that would create the most distrust and confusion, and make the generals do the most costly things to try and stop them from doing it again. When there are just a few traitors and a whole country opposing them, it stands to reason that what a few traitors do might be less damaging than what a whole country does to stop them, that the cure might be worse than the disease. Mr. Potter, said the defense professor, his voice suddenly cutting, the lesson of history is that you are simply wrong. Your parents' generation did too little to unify themselves, not too much. This whole country almost fell, Mr. Potter, though you were not there to see it. I suggest that you ask your dorm mates in Ravenclaw how many of them have lost family to the Dark Lord. Or if you are wiser, do not ask. Do you have a wish to make, Mr. Potter? If you don't mind, said the mild voice of Albus Dumbledore, I should like to hear what the boy who lived has to say. He has more experience than either of us at stopping wars. A few people laughed, but not many. Harry Potter's gaze moved to Dumbledore, and he looked considering for a moment. I'm not saying you're wrong, Professor Quirrell. In the last war, people didn't act together, and a whole country almost fell to a few dozen attackers, and yes, that was pathetic. And if we make the same mistake next time, yes, that'll be even more pathetic. But you never fight the same war twice. And the problem is, the enemy is also allowed to be smart. If you're divided, you're vulnerable in one way, but when you try to unite, then you face other risks, and other costs, and the enemy will try to take advantage of those, too. You can't stop thinking at just one level of the game. Simplicity also has a great deal to commend it, Mr. Potter, said the dry voice of the defense professor. I do hope that you have learned something this day about the dangers of strategies more complicated than uniting your people and attacking your enemy. And if all this does not tie into your wish somehow, I shall be quite annoyed. Yes, said Harry Potter, it was pretty difficult coming up with a wish to symbolize the costs of unity. But the problem of acting together isn't just for wars, it's something we have to solve all our lives, every day. If everyone is coordinating using the same rules, and the rules are stupid, then if one person decides to do things differently, they're breaking the rules. But if everyone decides to do things differently, they can. It's exactly the same problem of everyone needing to act together. But for the first person who speaks out, it seems like they're going against the crowd. And if you thought that the only important thing was that people should always be unified, then you could never change the game, no matter how stupid the rules. So my own wish, to symbolize what happens when people unite in the wrong direction, is that in Hogwarts we should play Quidditch without the snitch. What? Screamed 100 voices in the crowd, as Draco's jaw dropped. The snitch ruins the whole game, said Harry Potter. Everything the other players do ends up being irrelevant. It would make overwhelmingly more sense to just buy a clock. It's one of those incredibly stupid things you don't notice just because you grew up with it, that people only do because everyone else is doing it. But by that point Harry Potter's voice could no longer be heard, because the riot had started. The riot ended around 15 seconds later, after a gigantic spout of fire blasted out of the highest tower of Hogwarts to the sound of 100 thunders. Draco hadn't known Dumbledore could do that. The students sat down again very carefully and quietly. Professor Quirrell was laughing, without pause. So be it, Mr. Potter. Your will be done. The defense professor paused deliberately. Of course, I only promised one cunning plot. And that is all that the three of you will get. Draco had been half expecting the words earlier, but now they still came as a shock. Draco exchanged rapid glances with Granger. They would have been the obvious allies, but their wishes were directly opposed. You mean, said Harry, we have to all agree on a wish? Oh, that would be far too much to ask, said Professor Quirrell. The three of you have no common enemy, do you? And for one brief moment, so fast that Draco thought he might have imagined it, the defense professor's eyes flicked in the direction of Dumbledore. No, said Professor Quirrell, I mean that I shall grant 3 wishes using a single plot. There was a confused silence. You can't do that, Harry said flatly from beside Draco. Not even I can do that. 2 of those wishes are mutually incompatible. It's logically impossible, and then Harry cut himself off. You're a few years too young to tell me what I can't do, Mr. Potter, said Professor Quirrell, with a brief dry smile. Then the defense professor turned back to the watching students. Truthfully, I have no confidence in your ability to learn this day's lesson. Go home, and enjoy your time with your families, or what's left of them, while they still live. My own family is long since dead at the Dark Lord's hand. I shall see you all when classes resume. In the speechless silence that resulted, Professor Quirrell already turning to walk off the stage, Draco heard the defense professor's voice say, quietly and no longer amplified, but you, Mr. Potter, I would speak to now. 35. Coordination problems, PT3. They had gone to the defense professor's office, and Professor Quirrell had sealed the door before he leaned back in his chair and spoke. The defense professor's voice was very calm, and that unnerved Harry a good deal more than if Professor Quirrell had been shouting. I am trying, said Professor Quirrell quietly, to make allowances for the fact that you are young. That I myself, at the same age, was a quite extraordinary fool. You speak with adult style and meddle in adult games, and sometimes I forget that you are only a meddler. I hope, Mr. Potter, that your childish meddling has not just killed you, ruined your country, and lost the next war. It was very hard for Harry to control his breathing. Professor Quirrell, I said a good deal less than I wished to say, but I had to say something. Your proposals are extremely alarming to anyone who has the slightest familiarity with Muggle history over the last century. The Italian fascists, some very nasty people, got their name from the fasces, a bundle of rods bound together to symbolize the idea that unity is strength. So the nasty Italian fascists believed that unity is stronger than division, said Professor Quirrell. Sharpness was beginning to creep into his voice. Perhaps they also believed that the sky is blue, and advocated a policy of not dropping rocks on your head. Reversed stupidity is not intelligence. The world's stupidest person may say the sun is shining, but that doesn't make it dark out. Fine, you're right, that was an ad hominem argument, it's not wrong because the fascists said it. But Professor Quirrell, you can't have everyone in a country take the mark of one dictator. It's a single point of failure. Look, I'll put it this way. Suppose the enemy just imperious is whoever controls the mark. Powerful wizards are not so easy to imperious, said Professor Quirrell dryly. And if you cannot find a worthy leader, you are in any case doomed. But worthy leaders do exist, the question is whether the people shall follow them. Harry raked his hands through his hair in frustration. He wanted to call a timeout and make Professor Quirrell read the rise and fall of the Third Reich and then start the conversation over again. I don't suppose that if I suggested democracy was a better form of government than dictatorship. I see, said Professor Quirrell. His eyes closed briefly, then opened. Mr. Potter, the stupidity of Quidditch is transparent to you because you did not grow up revering the game. If you had never heard of elections, Mr. Potter, and you simply saw what is there, what you saw would not please you. Look to our elected Minister of Magic. Is he the wisest, the strongest, the greatest of our nation? No, he is a buffoon who is owned in fee simple by Lucius Malfoy. Wizards went to the polls and chose between Cornelius Fudge and Tanya Leach, who had competed with each other in a grand and entertaining contest after the Daily Prophet, which Lucius Malfoy also controls, decided that they were the only serious candidates. That Cornelius Fudge was genuinely selected as the best leader our country could offer is not a suggestion anyone could make with a straight face. It is no different in the Muggle world. From what I have heard and seen, the last Muggle newspaper I read mentioned that the previous president of the United States had been a retired movie actor. If you had not grown up with elections, Mr. Potter, they would be as transparently silly to you as Quidditch. Harry sat there with his mouth open, struggling for words. The point of elections isn't to produce the one best leader, it's to keep politicians scared enough of the voters that they don't go completely evil like dictators do. The last war, Mr. Potter, was fought between the Dark Lord and Dumbledore. And while Dumbledore was a flawed leader who was losing the war, it is ridiculous to suggest that any of the ministers of magic elected during that period could have taken Dumbledore's place. Strength flows from powerful wizards and their followers, not from elections and the fools they elect. That is the lesson of magical Britain's recent history, and I doubt that the next war will teach you a lesson any different. If you survive it, Mr. Potter, which you will not do unless you abandon the enthusiastic illusions of childhood. If you think there are no dangers in the course of action you advocate, said Harry, and despite everything his voice was growing sharp, then that, too, is childish enthusiasm. Harry stared grimly into Professor Quirrell's eyes, who stared back without blinking. Such dangers, said Professor Quirrell coldly, are to be discussed in offices like this one, not in speeches. The fools who elected Cornelius Fudge are not interested in complications and caution. Present them with anything more nuanced than a rousing cheer, and you will face your war alone. That, Mr. Potter, was your childish error, which Draco Malfoy would not have made even when he was 8 years old. It should have been obvious even to you that you should have stayed silent, and consulted with me first, not spoken your worries before the crowd. I am no friend of Albus Dumbledore, said Harry, a cold in his voice to match Professor Quirrell's. But he is no child, and he did not seem to think my concerns were childish, nor that I should have waited to speak them. Oh, said Professor Quirrell, so you take your cues from the headmaster now, do you? And stood up from behind his desk. When Blaise turned the corner on the way to the office, he saw that Professor Quirrell was already leaning against the wall. Blaise Zabini, said the defense professor, straightening. His eyes were set like dark stones within his face, and his voice sent a shiver of fear down Blaise's spine. He can't do anything against me, I just have to remember that. I believe, said Professor Quirrell, in a clear, cold voice, that I have already guessed the name of your employer. But I would hear it from your own lips, and tell me also the price that bought you. Blaise knew he was sweating under his robes, and that the moisture would be already visible on his forehead. I got a chance to show I was better than all 3 generals, and I took it. A lot of people hate me now, but there are also plenty of Slytherins who'll love me for it. What makes you think I'm? You did not devise the plan of today's battle, Mr. Zabini. Tell me who did. Blaise swallowed hard. Well, I mean, in that case. Then you already know who did, right? The only one who's that crazy is Dumbledore. And he'll protect me if you try to do anything. Indeed. Tell me the price. The defense professor's eyes were still hard. It's my cousin Kimberly, Blaise said, swallowing again and trying to control his voice. She's real, and she's really being bullied. Potter checked that, he wasn't dumb. Only Dumbledore said that he'd nudged the bullies into doing it just for the plan, and if I worked for him she'd be fine afterward, but if I did go with Potter, there was more trouble Kimberly could get into. Professor Quirrell was silent for a long moment. I see, Professor Quirrell said, his voice now much milder. Mr. Zabini, should such an event occur again, you may contact me directly. I have my own ways of protecting my friends. Now, a final question, even with all the power you took into your hands, forcing a tie would have been difficult. Did Dumbledore instruct you as to who should win otherwise? Sunshine, said Blaise. Professor Quirrell nodded. As I thought. The defense professor sighed. In your future career, Mr. Zabini, I do not suggest trying any plots that complicated. They have a tendency to fail. I said that to the headmaster, actually, Blaze said, and he said that was why it was important to have more than one plot going at a time. Professor Quirrell passed a weary hand across his forehead. It's a wonder the Dark Lord didn't go mad from fighting him. You may go on to your meeting with the headmaster, Mr. Zabini. I will say nothing of this, but if the headmaster should somehow discover that we have spoken, remember my standing offer to give you what protection I can. You are dismissed. Blaze didn't wait for any other word, just turned and fled. Professor Quirrell waited for a time, and then said, Go ahead, Mr. Potter. Harry tore the cloak of invisibility off his head and stuffed into his pouch. He was trembling with so much rage he could hardly speak. He did what? You should have deduced it yourself, Mr. Potter, Professor Quirrell said mildly. You must learn to blur your vision until you can see the forest obscured by the trees. Anyone who heard the stories about you, and who did not know that you were the mysterious boy who lived, could easily deduce your ownership of an invisibility cloak. Step back from these events, blur away their details, and what do we observe? There was a great rivalry between students, and their competition ended in a perfect tie. That sort of thing only happens in stories, Mr. Potter, and there is one person in this school who thinks in stories. There was a strange and complicated plot, which you should have realized was uncharacteristic of the young Slytherin you faced. But there is a person in this school who deals in plots that elaborate, and his name is not Zabini. And I did warn you that there was a quadruple agent, you knew that Zabini was at least a triple agent, and you should have guessed a high chance that it was he. No, I will not declare the battle invalid. All three of you failed the test, and lost to your common enemy. Harry didn't care about tests at this point. Dumbledore blackmailed Zabini by threatening his cousin. Just to make our battle end in a tie. Why? Professor Quirrell gave a mirthless laugh. Perhaps the headmaster thought the rivalry was good for his pet hero and wished to see it continue. For the greater good, you understand. Or perhaps he was simply mad. You see, Mr. Potter, everyone knows that Dumbledore's madness is a mask that he is sane pretending to be insane. They pride themselves on that clever insight, and knowing the secret explanation, they stop looking. It does not occur to them that it is also possible to have a mask behind the mask, to be insane pretending to be sane pretending to be insane. And I am afraid, Mr. Potter, that I have urgent business elsewhere, and must depart, but I should strongly advise you not to take your cues from Albus Dumbledore when fighting a war. Until later, Mr. Potter. And the defense professor inclined his head with some irony, and then strode off in the same direction Zabini had fled, while Harry was still standing in open-mouthed shock. Aftermath, Harry Potter. Harry trudged slowly toward the Ravenclaw dorm, eyes unseeing of walls, paintings, or other students. He went upstairs and down ramps without slowing, speeding, or noticing where he trod. It had taken him more than a minute after Professor Quirrell's departure to realize that his only source of information about Dumbledore being involved was a Blaze Zabini, who he would have to be an absolute gaping idiot to trust again, and b. Professor Quirrell, who could have easily faked a plot in Dumbledore's style, and who might also think that a little student rivalry was a fine thing, and who had, if you stepped back and blurred out the details, just proposed turning the country into a magical dictatorship. And it was also possible that Dumbledore was the one behind Zabini, and that Professor Quirrell had been sincerely trying to fight the dark mark in kind, and prevent the repetition of a performance he saw as pathetic. Trying to make sure that Harry didn't end up fighting the Dark Lord alone, while everyone else hid, frightened, trying to stay out of the line of fire, waiting for Harry to save them. But the truth was, well, Harry was sort of okay with that. It was, he knew, the kind of thing that was supposed to make heroes resentful and bitter. To heck with that. Harry was very much in favor of everyone else staying out of danger while the boy who lived took down the Dark Lord by himself, plus or minus a small number of companions. If the next conflict with the Dark Lord got to the point of a second wizarding war that killed lots of people and embroiled a whole country, that would mean Harry had already failed. And if afterward a war broke out between wizards and muggles, it didn't matter who won, Harry would have already failed by letting it get that far. Besides, who said the societies couldn't peacefully integrate when the secrecy inevitably broke down? Though Harry could hear Professor Quirrell's dry voice in his mind, asking him if he was a fool, and saying all the obvious things. And if mages and muggles couldn't live in peace, then Harry would combine magic and science and figure out how to evacuate all the wizards to Mars or somewhere, instead of letting a war break out. Because if it did come down to a war of extermination, that was the thing Professor Quirrell hadn't realized, the one most important question he'd forgotten to ask his young general. The real reason why Harry had no intention of being argued into endorsing a light mark, no matter how much it would help him in his fight against the Dark Lord. One Dark Lord and 50 marked followers had been a peril to all of magical Britain. If all Britain took the mark of a strong leader, they would be a peril to the whole magical world. And if the whole wizarding world took a single mark, they would be a danger to the rest of humanity. No one knew quite how many wizards there were in the world. He'd done a few estimates with Hermione and come up with numbers in the rough range of 1 million. But there were 6 billion muggles. If it came down to a final war, Professor Quirrell had forgotten to ask Harry which side he would protect. A scientific civilization, reaching outward, looking upward, knowing that its destiny was to grasp the stars. And a magical civilization, slowly fading as knowledge was lost, still governed by a nobility that saw muggles as not quite human. It was a terribly sad feeling, but not one that held any hint of doubt. Aftermath. Blaise Zabini. Blaise strolled through the hallways with careful, self-imposed slowness, his heart beating wildly as he tried to calm down. Ahem, said a dry, whispering voice from a shadowy alcove as he passed. Blaise jumped, but he didn't scream. Slowly, he turned. In that small, shadowy corner was a black cloak so wide and billowing that it was impossible to determine whether the figure beneath was male or female, and atop the cloak a broad-brimmed black hat, and a black mist seemed to gather beneath it and obscure the face of whoever or whatever might lie beneath. Report, whispered Mr. Hat and Cloak. I said just what you told me to, said Blaise. His voice was a little calmer now that he wasn't lying to anyone. And Professor Quirrell reacted just the way you expected. The broad black hat tilted and straightened, as though the head below had nodded. Excellent, said the unidentifiable whisper. The reward I promised you is already on its way to your mother, by owl. Blaise hesitated, but his curiosity was eating him alive. Can I ask now why you want to cause trouble between Professor Quirrell and Dumbledore? The headmaster hadn't had anything to do with the Gryffindor bullies that Blaise knew about, and besides helping Kimberly, the headmaster had also offered to make Professor Binns give him excellent marks in history of magic even if he turned in blank parchments for his homework, though he'd still have to attend class and pretend to hand them in. Actually, Blaise would have betrayed all 3 generals for free, and never mind his cousin either, but he'd seen no need to say that. The broad black hat cocked to one side, as if to convey a quizzical stare. Tell me, friend Blaise, did it occur to you that traitors who betray so many times over often meet with ill ends? Nope, said Blaise, looking straight into the black mist under the hat. Everyone knows that nothing really bad ever happens to students in Hogwarts. Mr. Hat and Cloak gave a whispery chuckle. Indeed, said the whisper. With the murder of one student 5 decades ago being the exception that proves the rule, since Salazar Slytherin would have keyed his monster into the ancient wards at a higher level than the headmaster himself. Blaise stared at the black mist, now beginning to feel a little uneasy. But it ought to take a Hogwarts professor to do anything significant to him without setting off alarms. Quirrell and Snape were the only professors who'd do something like this, and Quirrell wouldn't care about fooling himself, and Snape wouldn't hurt one of his own Slytherins. Would he? No, friend Blaise, whispered the black mist, I only wish to advise you never to try anything like this in your adult life. So many betrayals would certainly lead to at least one vengeance. My mother never got any vengeances, said Blaise proudly. Even though she married 7 husbands and every single one of them died mysteriously and left her lots of money. Really? Said the whisper. However did she persuade the 7th to marry her after he heard what happened to the first 6? I asked Mum that, said Blaise, and she said I couldn't know until I was old enough, and I asked her how old was old enough, and she said, older than her. Again the whispery chuckle. Well then, friend Blaise, my congratulations on having followed in your mother's footsteps. Go, and if you say nothing of this, we will not meet again. Blaise backed uneasily away, feeling an odd reluctance to turn his back. The hat tilted. Oh, come now, little Slytherin. If you were truly the equal of Harry Potter or Draco Malfoy, you would have already realized that my hinted threats were just to ensure your silence before Albus. Had I intended to harm, I would not have hinted. Had I said nothing, then you should have worried. Blaise straightened, feeling a little insulted, and nodded to Mr. Hat and Cloak, then turned decisively and strode off toward his meeting with the headmaster. He'd been hoping to the very end that someone else would show up and give him a chance to sell out Mr. Hat and Cloak. But then Mum hadn't betrayed 7 different husbands at the same time. When you looked at it that way, he was still doing better than her. And Blaise Zabini went on walking toward the headmaster's office, smiling, content to be a quintuple agent. For a moment the boy stumbled, but then straightened, shaking off the odd feeling of disorientation. And Blaise Zabini went on walking toward the headmaster's office, smiling, content to be a quadruple agent. Aftermath. Hermione Granger. The messenger didn't approach her until she was alone. Hermione was just leaving the girls' bathroom where she sometimes hid to think, and a bright shining cat leapt out of nowhere and said, Miss Granger. She let out a little shriek before she realized the cat had spoken in Professor McGonagall's voice. Even so she hadn't been frightened, only startled. The cat was bright and brilliant and beautiful, glowing with a white-silver radiance like moon-colored sunlight, and she couldn't imagine being scared. What are you? Said Hermione. This is a message from Professor McGonagall, said the cat still in the professor's voice. Can you come to my office, and not speak of this to anyone? I'll be there right away, said Hermione, still surprised, and the cat leapt and vanished, only it didn't vanish, it traveled away somehow, or that was what her mind said, even though her eyes just saw it disappear. By the time Hermione had got to the office of her favorite professor, her mind was all awhirl with speculations. Was there something wrong with her transfiguration scores? But then why would Professor McGonagall say not to tell anyone? It was probably about Harry practicing his partial transfiguration. Professor McGonagall's face looked worried, not stern, as Hermione seated herself in front of the desk, trying to keep her eyes from going to the nest of cubbyholes containing Professor McGonagall's homework. She'd always wondered what sort of work grown-ups had to do to keep the school running and whether they could use any help from her. Miss Granger, said Professor McGonagall, let me start by saying that I already know about the headmaster asking you to make that wish. He told you, blurted Hermione in startlement. The headmaster had said no one else was supposed to know. Professor McGonagall paused, looked at Hermione, and gave a sad little chuckle. It's good to see Mr. Potter hasn't corrupted you too much. Miss Granger, you aren't supposed to admit anything just because I say I know. As it happens, the headmaster did not tell me, I simply know him too well. Hermione was blushing furiously now. It's fine, Miss Granger, said Professor McGonagall hastily. You're a Ravenclaw in your first year, nobody expects you to be a Slytherin. That really stung. Fine, said Hermione with some acerbity, I'll go ask Harry Potter for Slytherin lessons, then. That wasn't what I wanted to, said Professor McGonagall, and her voice trailed off. Miss Granger, I'm worried about this because young Ravenclaw girls shouldn't have to be Slytherins. If the headmaster asks you to get involved in something you're not comfortable with, Miss Granger, it really is all right to say no. And if you're feeling pressured, please tell the headmaster that you would like me to be there, or that you would like to ask me first. Hermione's eyes were very wide. Does the headmaster do things that are wrong? Professor McGonagall looked a little sad at that. Not on purpose, Miss Granger, but I think. Well, it probably is true that sometimes the headmaster has trouble remembering what it's like to be a child. Even when he was a child, I'm sure he must have been brilliant, and strong of mind and heart, with courage enough for 3 Gryffindors. Sometimes the headmaster asks too much of his young students, Miss Granger, or isn't careful enough not to hurt them. He is a good man, but sometimes his plotting can go too far. But it's good for students to be strong and have courage, said Hermione. That's why you suggested Gryffindor for me, wasn't it? Professor McGonagall smiled wryly. Perhaps I was only being selfish, wanting you for my own house. Did the Sorting Hat offer you? No, I should not have asked. It told me I might go anywhere but Slytherin, said Hermione. She'd almost asked why she wasn't good enough for Slytherin, before she'd managed to stop herself. So I have courage, Professor. Professor McGonagall leaned forward over her desk. The worry was showing plainer on her face now. Miss Granger, it's not about courage, it's about what's healthy for young girls. The headmaster is drawing you into his plots, Harry Potter is giving you his secrets to keep, and now you're making alliances with Draco Malfoy. And I promised your mother that you would be safe at Hogwarts. Hermione just didn't know what to say to that. But the thought was occurring to her that Professor McGonagall might not have been warning her if she'd been a boy in Gryffindor instead of a girl in Ravenclaw, and that was, well. I'll try to be good, she said, and I won't let anyone tell me otherwise. Professor McGonagall pressed her hands over her eyes. When she took them away, her lined face looked very old. Yes, she said in a whisper, you would have done well in my house. Stay safe, Miss Granger, and be careful. And if you are ever worried or uncomfortable about anything, please come to me at once. I won't keep you any longer. Aftermath, Draco Malfoy. Neither of them really wanted to do anything complicated that Saturday, not after fighting a battle earlier. So Draco was just sitting in an unused classroom and trying to read a book called Thinking Physics. It was one of the most fascinating things that Draco had ever read in his life, at least the parts he could understand, at least when the accursed idiot who refused to let his books out of his sight could manage to shut up and let Draco concentrate. Hermione Granger is a mudblood, sang Harry Potter from where he sat at a nearby desk, reading a far more advanced book of his own. I know what you're trying to do, said Draco calmly without looking up from the pages. It's not going to work. We're still ganging up and crushing you. A Malfoy is working with a mudblood, what will all your father's friends think? They'll think Malfoys aren't as easily manipulated as you seem to believe, Potter. The defense professor was crazier than Dumbledore, no future savior of the world could ever be this childish and undignified at any age. Hey, Draco, you know what's really going to suck. You know that Hermione Granger has 2 copies of the magical allele, just like you and just like me, but all your classmates in Slytherin don't know that, and you are not allowed to explain. Draco's fingers were widening where they gripped the book. Being beaten and spat upon couldn't possibly require this much self-control, and if he didn't get back at Harry soon, he was going to do something incriminating. So what did you wish the first time? Said Draco. Harry didn't say anything, so Draco looked up from his book, and felt a twinge of malicious satisfaction at the sad look on Harry's face. Harry said. A lot of people ask me that, but I don't think Professor Quirrell would have wanted me to talk about it. Draco put a serious look on his own face. You can talk about it with me. It's probably not important compared to the other secrets you've told me, and what else are friends for? That's right, I'm your friend. Feel guilty. It wasn't really all that interesting, Harry said with obviously artificial lightness. Just, I wish Professor Quirrell would teach battle magic again next year. Harry sighed, and looked back down at his book. And said, after another few seconds, your father's probably going to be pretty upset with you this Christmas, but if you promise him that you'll betray the Mudblood girl and wipe out her army, everything will go back to being alright, and you'll still get your Christmas presents. Maybe if he and Granger asked Professor Quirrell extra politely and used some of their Quirrell points, the two of them would be allowed to do something more interesting to General Chaos than putting him to sleep. 36. Status differentials. Wrenching disorientation, that was how it felt to walk out of platform 9 and 3/4 into the rest of Earth, the world that Harry had once thought was the only real world. People dressed in casual shirts and pants, instead of the more dignified robes of wizards and witches. Scattered bits of trash here and there around the benches. A forgotten smell, the fumes of burned gasoline, raw and sharp in the air. The ambiance of the King's Cross train station, less bright and cheerful than Hogwarts or Diagon Alley, the people seemed smaller, more afraid, and likely would have eagerly traded their problems for a dark wizard to fight. Harry wanted to cast Scourgify for the dirt, and Everdo for the garbage, and if he'd known the spell, a bubblehead charm so he wouldn't have to breathe the air. But he couldn't use his wand, in this place. This, Harry realized, must be what it felt like to go from a first world country to a third world country. Only it was the zeroth world which Harry had left, the wizarding world, of cleansing charms and house elves, where, between the healer's arts and your own magic, you could hit 170 before old age really started catching up with you. And non-magical London, Muggle Earth, to which Harry had temporarily returned. This was where Mum and Dad would live out the rest of their lives, unless technology leapfrogged over wizardry's quality of life, or something deeper in the world changed. Without even thinking about it, Harry's head turned and his eyes darted behind him to see the wooden trunk that was scurrying after him, unnoticed by any muggles, the clawed tentacles offering quick confirmation that, yes, he hadn't just imagined it all. And then there was the other reason for the tight feeling in his chest. His parents didn't know. They didn't know anything. They didn't know. Harry, called a thin, blonde woman whose perfectly smooth and unblemished skin made her look a good deal younger than 33, and Harry realized with a start that it was magic. He hadn't known the signs before, but he could see them now. And whatever sort of potion lasted that long, it must have been terribly dangerous, because most witches didn't do that to themselves, they weren't that desperate. There was water gathering in Harry's eyes. Harry, yelled an older-looking man with a paunch gathering about his stomach, dressed with ostentatious academic carelessness in a black vest thrown over a dark gray-green shirt, someone who would always be a professor anywhere he went, who would certainly have been one of the most brilliant wizards of his generation, if he'd been born with 2 copies of that gene, instead of 0. Harry raised his hand and waved to them. He couldn't speak. He couldn't speak at all. They came over to him, not running, but at a steady, dignified walk. That was how fast Professor Michael Veras Evans walked, and Mrs. Petunia Evans Veras wasn't about to walk any faster. The smile on his father's face wasn't very wide, but then his father never was given to huge smiles. It was, at least, as wide as Harry had ever seen it, wider than when a new grant came in, or when one of his students got a position, and you couldn't ask for a wider smile than that. Mum was blinking hard, and she was trying to smile but not doing a very good job. So, said his father as he came striding up. Made any revolutionary discoveries yet? Of course Dad thought he was joking. It hadn't hurt quite so much when his parents didn't believe in him, back when no one else had believed in him either, back when Harry hadn't known how it felt to be taken seriously by people like Headmaster Dumbledore and Professor Quirrell. And that was when Harry realized that the boy who lived only existed in magical Britain, that there wasn't any such person in Muggle London, just a cute little 11-year-old boy going home for Christmas. Excuse me, Harry said, his voice trembling, I'm going to break down and cry now. It doesn't mean there was anything wrong at school. Harry started to move forward, and then stopped, torn between hugging his father and hugging his mother. He didn't want either one to feel slighted or that Harry loved them more than the other. You, said his father, are a very silly boy, Mr. Veras, and he gently took Harry by the shoulders and pushed him into the arms of his mother, who was kneeling down, tears already streaking her cheek. Hello, Mum, Harry said with his voice wavering, I'm back. And he hugged her, amid the noisy mechanical sounds and the smell of burned gasoline, and Harry started crying, because he knew that nothing could go back, least of all him. The sky was completely dark, and stars were coming out by the time they negotiated the Christmas traffic to the university town that was Oxford, and parked in the driveway of the small, dingy-looking old house that their family used to keep the rain off their books. As they walked up the brief stretch of pavement leading to the front door, they passed a series of flower pots holding small, dim electric lights, dim since they had to recharge themselves off solar power during the day, and the lights lit up just as they passed. The hard part had been finding motion sensors that were waterproof and triggered at just the right distance. In Hogwarts there were real torches like that. And then the front door opened and Harry stepped into their living room, blinking hard. Every inch of wall space is covered by a bookcase. Each bookcase has 6 shelves, going almost to the ceiling. Some bookshelves are stacked to the brim with hardcover books, science, math, history, and everything else. Other shelves have 2 layers of paperback science fiction, with the back layer of books propped up on old tissue boxes or 2x4s, so that you can see the back layer of books above the books in front. And it still isn't enough. Books are overflowing onto the tables and the sofas and making little heaps under the windows. The Varys household was just as he'd left it, only with more books, which was also just how he'd left it. And a Christmas tree, naked and undecorated just 2 days before Christmas Eve, which threw Harry briefly before he realized, with a warm feeling blossoming in his chest, that of course his parents had waited. "We took the bed out of your room to make room for more bookcases," said his father. "You can sleep in your trunk, right?" "You can sleep in my trunk," said Harry. "That reminds me," said his father. "What did they end up doing about your sleep cycle?" "Magic," Harry said, making a beeline for the door that opened upon his bedroom, just in case Dad wasn't joking. "That's not an explanation," said Professor Varys Evans, just as Harry shouted, "You used up all the open space on my bookcases." Harry had spent the 23rd of December shopping for Muggle things that he couldn't just transfigure. His father had been busy and had said that Harry would need to walk or take the bus, which had suited Harry just fine. Some of the people at the hardware store had given Harry questioning looks, but he'd said with an innocent voice that his father was shopping nearby and was very busy and had sent him to get some things, holding up a list in carefully adult-looking half-illegible handwriting, and in the end, money was money. They had all decorated the Christmas tree together, and Harry had put a tiny dancing fairy on top, 2 sickles, 5 nuts at Gamble and Japes. Gringotts had readily exchanged galleons for paper money, but they didn't seem to have any simple way to turn larger quantities of gold into tax-free, unsuspicious Muggle money in a numbered Swiss bank account. This had rather spiked Harry's plan to turn most of the money he'd self-stolen into a sensible mix of 60% international index funds and 40% Berkshire Hathaway. For the moment, Harry had diversified his assets a little further by sneaking out late at night, invisible and time-turned, and burying 100 golden galleons in the backyard. He'd always wanted to do that anyway. Some of December 24th had been spent with the professor reading Harry's books and asking questions. Most of the experiments his father had suggested were impractical, at least for the moment. Of those remaining, Harry had done many of them already. "Yes, Dad, I checked what happened if Hermione was given a changed pronunciation and she didn't know whether it was changed. That was the very first experiment I did, Dad." The last question Harry's father had asked, looking up from magical drafts and potions with an expression of bewildered disgust, was whether it all made sense if you were a wizard, and Harry had answered no. Whereupon his father had declared that magic was unscientific. Harry was still a little shocked at the idea of pointing to a section of reality and calling it unscientific. Dad seemed to think that the conflict between his intuitions and the universe meant that the universe had a problem. Then again, there were lots of physicists who thought that quantum mechanics was weird, instead of quantum mechanics being normal and them being weird. Harry had shown his mother the healer's kit he'd bought to keep in their house, though most of the potions wouldn't work on Dad. Mum had stared at the kit in a way that made Harry ask whether Mum's sister had ever bought anything like that for Grandpa Edwin and Grandma Elaine. And when Mum still hadn't answered, Harry had said hastily that she must have just never thought of it. And then, finally, he'd fled the room. Lily Evans probably hadn't thought of it. That was the sad thing. Harry knew that other people had a tendency to not think about painful subjects, in the same way they had a tendency not to deliberately rest their hands on red-hot stove burners, and Harry was starting to suspect that most Muggleborns rapidly acquired a tendency to not think about their family, who were all going to die before they reached their first century anyway. Not that Harry had any intention of letting that happen, of course. And then it was late in the day on December 24th and they were driving off for their Christmas Eve dinner. The house was huge, not by Hogwarts standards, but certainly by the standards of what you could get if your father was a distinguished professor trying to live in Oxford. 2 stories of brick gleaming in the setting sun, with windows on top of windows and one tall window that went up much further than glass should go. That was going to be one huge living room. Harry took a deep breath, and rang the doorbell. There was a distant call of, "Honey, can you get it?" This was followed by a slow patter of approaching steps. And then the door opened to reveal a genial man, of fat and rosy cheeks and thinning hair, in a blue button-down shirt straining slightly at the seams. "Dr. Granger," Harry's father said briskly, before Harry could even speak. "I'm Michael, and this is Petunia and our son Harry. The food's in the magical trunk, and Dad made a vague gesture behind him, not quite in the direction of the trunk, as it happened. Yes, please, come in, said Leo Granger. He stepped forward and took the wine bottle from the professor's outstretched hands, with a muttered thank you, and then stepped back and waved at the living room. Have a seat. And, his head turning down to address Harry, all the toys are downstairs in the basement, I'm sure Herm will be down shortly, it's the first door on your right, and pointed toward a hallway. Harry just looked at him for a moment, conscious that he was blocking his parents from coming in. Toys, said Harry in a bright, high-pitched voice, with his eyes wide. I love toys. There was an intake of breath from his mother behind him, and Harry strode into the house, managing not to stomp too hard as he walked. The living room was every bit as large as it had looked from outside, with a huge vaulted ceiling dangling a gigantic chandelier, and a Christmas tree that must have been murder to maneuver through the door. The lower levels of the tree were thoroughly and carefully decorated in neat patterns of red and green and gold, with a newfound sprinkling of blue and bronze. The heights that only a grown-up could reach were carelessly, randomly draped with strings of lights and wreaths of tinsel. A hallway extended until it terminated in the cabinetry of a kitchen, and wooden stairs with polished metal railings stretched up toward a second floor. Gosh, Harry said, this is a big house. I hope I don't get lost in here. Dr. Roberta Granger was feeling rather nervous as dinner approached. The turkey and the roast, their own contributions to the common project, were steadily cooking away in the oven. The other dishes were to be brought by their guests, the Veras family, who had adopted a boy named Harry, who was known to the wizarding world as the boy who lived, and who was also the only boy that Hermione had ever called cute, or noticed at all, really. The Verases had said that Hermione was the only child in Harry's age group whose existence their son had ever acknowledged in any way whatsoever. And it might have been jumping the gun just a little, but both couples had a sneaking suspicion that wedding bells might be in the offing a few years down the road. So while Christmas Day would be spent, as always, with her husband's family, they'd decided to spend Christmas Eve meeting their daughter's possible future in-laws. The doorbell rang while she was right in the middle of basting the turkey, and she raised her voice and shouted, "Honey, can you get it?" There was a brief groan of a chair and its occupant, and then there was the sound of her husband's heavy footsteps and the door swinging open. Dr. Granger, said an older man's brisk voice. I'm Michael, and this is Petunia and our son Harry. The food's in the magical trunk. Yes, please, come in, said her husband, followed by a muttered thank you that indicated some sort of present had been accepted, and, have a seat. Then Leo's voice altered to a tone of artificial enthusiasm, and said, and all the toys are downstairs in the basement, I'm sure Herm will be down shortly, it's the first door on your right. There was a brief pause. Then a young boy's bright voice said, toys. I love toys. There was the sound of footsteps entering the house, and then the same bright voice said, gosh. This is a big house. I hope I don't get lost in here. Roberta closed up the oven, smiling. She'd been a bit worried about the way Hermione's letters had described the boy who lived, though certainly her daughter hadn't said anything indicating that Harry Potter was dangerous, nothing like the dark hints written in the books Roberta had bought, supposedly for Hermione, during their trip to Diagon Alley. Her daughter hadn't said much at all, only that Harry talked like he came out of a book, and Hermione was studying harder than she ever had in her life just to stay ahead of him in class. But from the sound of it, Harry Potter was an ordinary 11-year-old boy. She got to the front door just as her daughter came clattering frantically down the stairs at a speed that didn't look safe at all. Hermione had claimed that witches were more resistant to falls, but Roberta wasn't quite sure she believed that. Roberta took in her first sight of Professor and Mrs. Veras, who were both looking rather nervous, just as the boy with the legendary scar on his forehead turned to her daughter and said, now in a lower voice, well met on this fairest of evenings, Miss Granger. His hand stretched back, as though offering his parents on a silver platter. I present to you my father, Professor Michael Veras Evans, and my mother, Mrs. Petunia Evans Veras. And as Roberta's mouth was gaping open, the boy turned back to his parents and said, now in that bright voice again, Mum, Dad, this is Hermione. She's really smart. Harry, hissed her daughter, stop that. The boy swiveled again to regard Hermione. I'm afraid, Miss Granger, the boy said gravely, that you and I have been exiled to the labyrinthine recesses of the basement. Let us leave them to their adult conversations, which would no doubt soar far above our own childish intellects, and resume our ongoing discussion of the implications of Humean projectivism for transfiguration. Excuse us, please, said her daughter in a very firm tone, and grabbed the boy by his left sleeve, and dragged him into the hallway. Roberta swiveled helplessly to track them as they went past her. The boy gave her a cheery wave, and then Hermione pulled the boy into the basement access and slammed the door behind her. I apologize for, said Mrs. Veras in a faltering voice. I'm sorry, said the professor, smiling fondly. Harry can be a bit touchy about that sort of thing. But I expect he's right about us not being interested in their conversation. Is he dangerous? Roberta wanted to ask, but she kept her silence and tried to think of subtler questions. Her husband beside her was chuckling, as if he'd found what they'd just seen funny, rather than frightening. The most terrible Dark Lord in history had tried to kill that boy, and the burnt husk of his body had been found next to the crib. Her possible future son-in-law. Roberta had been increasingly apprehensive about giving her daughter over to witchcraft, especially after she'd read the books, put the dates together, and realized that her magical mother had probably been killed at the height of Grindelwald's terror, not died giving birth to her as her father had always claimed. But Professor McGonagall had made other visits after her first trip to see how Miss Granger is doing, and Roberta couldn't help but think that if Hermione said her parents were being troublesome about her witching career, something would be done to fix them. Roberta put her best smile on her face, and did what she could to spread some pretended Christmas cheer. The dining room table was much longer than 6 people, or 4 people and 2 children, really needed, but all of it was draped with a tablecloth of fine white linen, and the dishes had been needlessly transferred to fancy serving plates, which at least were of stainless steel rather than real silver. Harry was having a bit of trouble concentrating on the turkey. The conversation had turned to Hogwarts, naturally, and it had been obvious to Harry that his parents were hoping that Hermione would trip up and say more about Harry's school life than Harry had been telling them. And either Hermione had realized this, or she was just automatically steering clear of anything that might prove troublesome. So Harry was fine. But unfortunately Harry had made the mistake of owling his parents with all sorts of facts about Hermione that she hadn't told her own parents. Like that she was general of an army in their after-school activities. Hermione's mother had looked very alarmed, and Harry had quickly interrupted and done his best to explain that all the spells were stunners, Professor Quirrell was always watching, and the existence of magical healing meant that lots of things were much less dangerous than they sounded, at which point Hermione had kicked him hard under the table. Thankfully Harry's father, who Harry had to admit was better than him at some things, had announced with firm professorial authority that he hadn't worried at all, since he couldn't imagine children being allowed to do it if it was dangerous. That wasn't why Harry was having trouble enjoying dinner, though. The problem with feeling sorry for yourself was that it never took any time at all to find someone else who had it worse. Dr. Leo Granger had asked, at one point, whether that nice teacher who'd seemed to like Hermione, Professor McGonagall, was awarding her lots of points in school. Hermione had said yes, with an apparently genuine smile. Harry had managed, with some effort, to stop himself from icily pointing out that Professor McGonagall would never show favoritism to any Hogwarts student, and that Hermione was getting lots of points because she'd earned every single one. At another point, Leo Granger had offered the table his opinion that Hermione was very smart and could have gone to medical school and become a dentist, if not for the whole witch business. Hermione had smiled again, and a quick glance had prevented Harry from suggesting Hermione might also have been an internationally famous scientist, and asking whether that thought would have occurred to the Grangers if they'd had a son instead of a daughter, or if it was unacceptable either way for their offspring to do better than them. But Harry was rapidly reaching his boiling point. And becoming a lot more appreciative of the fact that his own father had always done everything he could to support Harry's development as a prodigy and always encouraged him to reach higher and never belittled a single one of his accomplishments, even if a child prodigy was still just a child. Was this the sort of household he could have ended up in, if Mum had married Vernon Dursley? Harry was doing what he could, though. And she's really beating you in all your classes except broomstick riding and transfiguration, said Professor Michael Barras-Evans. Yes, Harry said with forced calm, as he cut himself another bite of Christmas Eve turkey. By solid margins, in most of them. There were other circumstances under which Harry would have been more reluctant to admit that, which was why he hadn't gotten around to telling his father until now. Hermione has always been quite good in school, said Dr. Leo Granger in a satisfied tone. Harry competes at the national level, said Professor Michael Barras-Evans. Dear, said Petunia. Hermione was giggling, and that wasn't making Harry feel any better about her situation. It didn't seem to bother Hermione, and that bothered Harry. I'm not embarrassed to lose to her, Dad, Harry said. Right at this moment he wasn't. Did I mention that she memorized all her school books before the first day of class? And yes, I tested it. Is that, usual for her? Professor Barras-Evans said to the Grangers. Oh, yes, Hermione's always memorizing things, said Dr. Roberta Granger with a cheerful smile. She knows every recipe in all my cookbooks by heart. I miss her every time I make dinner. Judging by the look on his father's face, Dad was feeling at least some of what Harry felt. Don't worry, Dad, Harry said, she's getting all the advanced material she can take now. Her teachers at Hogwarts know she's smart, unlike her parents. His voice had risen on the last 3 words, and even as all faces turned to stare at him and Hermione kicked him again, Harry knew that he'd blown it, but it was too much, just way too much. Of course we know she's smart, said Leo Granger, starting to look offended at the child who'd had the temerity to raise his voice at their dinner table. You don't have the tiniest idea, said Harry, the ice now leaking into his voice. You think she reads a lot of books and it's cute, right? You see a perfect report card and you think it's good that she's doing well in class. Your daughter is the most talented witch of her generation and the brightest star of Hogwarts, and someday, Dr. Granger, the fact that you were her parents will be the only reason that history remembers you. Hermione, who had calmly got up from her seat and walked around the table, chose that moment to grab Harry's shirt by the shoulder and pull him out of his chair. Harry let himself be pulled, but as Hermione dragged him away, he said, raising his voice even louder, "It is entirely possible that in 1,000 years, the fact that Hermione Granger's parents were dentists will be the only reason anyone remembers dentistry." Roberta stared at where her daughter had just dragged the boy who lived out of the room with a patient look upon her young face. "I'm terribly sorry," said Professor Veras with an amused smile. "But please don't worry, Harry always talks like that. Aren't they just like a married couple already?" The frightening thing was that they were. Harry had been expecting a rather severe lecture from Hermione. But after Hermione pulled them into the basement access and closed the door behind them, she'd turned around and was smiling, genuinely so far as Harry could tell. "Please don't, Harry," she said in a soft voice. "Even though it's very nice of you. Everything's fine." Harry just looked at her. "How can you stand it?" he said. He had to keep his voice quiet, they didn't want the parents to hear, but it rose in pitch if not in volume. "How can you stand it?" Hermione shrugged, and said, "Because that's the way parents should be." "No," Harry said, his voice low and intense, "it's not. My father never puts me down. Well, he does, but never like that." Hermione held up a single finger, and Harry waited, watching her search for words. It took her a while before she said, "Harry. Professor McGonagall and Professor Flitwick like me because I'm the most talented witch of my generation and the brightest star of Hogwarts. And Mum and Dad don't know that, and you'll never be able to tell them, but they love me anyway. Which means that everything is just the way it should be, at Hogwarts and at home. And since they're my parents, Mr. Potter, you don't get to argue." She was once again smiling her mysterious smile from dinner time, and looking at Harry very fondly. "Is that clear, Mr. Potter?" Harry nodded tightly. "Good," said Hermione, and leaned over and kissed him on the cheek. The conversation had only just gotten started again when a distant high-pitched yelp floated back to them. "Hey, no kissing." The two fathers burst out in laughter just as the two mothers rose up from their chairs with identical looks of horror and dashed toward the basement. When the children had been brought back, Hermione was saying in an icy tone that she was never going to kiss Harry ever again, and Harry was saying in an outraged voice that the sun would burn down to a cold dead cinder before he let her get close enough to try. Which meant that everything was just the way it should be, and they all sat back down again to finish their Christmas dinner.